Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. 23 years on the force teaches you to trust your instincts, but it also teaches you that some calls stick with you longer than others. This one happened during my rotation as a patrol sergeant for the Millfield County Sheriff's Department, back in the spring of 2019. I was assigned to the night shift, covering the rural sectors that included what locals called the Dead Zone, a 12-mile radius around the old Hartwell nuclear facility. The plant had been decommissioned in 2011 after a cooling system failure that never quite made national news. No radiation leak, they said, just structural damage that made continued operation economically unfeasible. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had sealed the facility and established a restricted perimeter. Signs every 100 yards, authorized personnel only. Radiation hazard. Federal crime to enter. My patrol route took me around that perimeter fence twice per shift. Standard procedure. Not because we expected trouble, but because the NRC required documented security sweeps as part of the decommissioning oversight. Most nights, it was routine. Drive the access road, check the gates, log the time, move on. But that Tuesday night in April was different. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Dispatch crackled over the radio with that tone that meant business. Unit 23, respond to Gate 7, Hartwell facility. Possible trespassing in progress. Complainant reports seeing multiple individuals on foot inside the perimeter. I keyed up immediately. Unit 23 copy, en route, ETA 12 minutes. Unit 23, be advised complainant is Hartwell security contractor. States he observed approximately 4 subjects with flashlights moving north from the main cooling tower complex toward the administrative building. That got my attention. The cooling towers were nearly 2 miles inside the perimeter. You don't just stumble across that fence by accident. I called for backup. Dispatch, Unit 23, requesting additional unit for federal property violation. Copy, Unit 23. Dispatching Unit 19, Officer Blake responding. Blake was solid. 5 years younger than me, but he'd worked these rural routes long enough to know the area. More importantly, he knew the protocols for dealing with federal restricted zones. Any arrest inside that perimeter required coordination with federal authorities. Any evidence collected had to follow chain of custody procedures that most local departments never deal with. I reached Gate 7 first. It's the main contractor entrance, normally secured with both electronic locks and traditional chains. The gate was closed, but the electronic panel was flashing red, indicating it had been opened within the last 4 hours. That wasn't right. No scheduled maintenance, no authorized personnel logged for night access. Blake arrived 3 minutes later. We parked outside the perimeter and approached on foot. Standard protocol dictated that we could not enter the restricted zone without federal authorization unless in immediate pursuit of a fleeing felon or responding to an imminent threat to human life. "What's the play here, Sarge?" Blake asked, adjusting his duty belt. He was carrying standard patrol loadout, Glock 19, taser, ASP baton, radio, flashlight. His body camera was already recording. "We secure the perimeter first," I replied. "Document any signs of breach. If we can establish visual contact with subjects inside the zone, we call it into NRC emergency line and wait for federal response." The gate showed clear evidence of tampering. Someone had used bolt cutters on the chain backup locks. Professional work, clean cuts, no damaged metal. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I radioed it in. Dispatch, Unit 23 at Gate 7, confirmed forced entry. Request patch through to NRC Emergency Response. Unit 23, stand by for federal contact. While we waited, Blake and I conducted a visual sweep of the fence line using our departmental binoculars. The Hartwell facility sprawled across nearly 800 acres. Two massive cooling towers dominated the landscape, their concrete shells rising like monuments against the night sky. Beyond them, we could see the main reactor building, the administrative complex, and various support structures. No signs of movement from our position. No lights inside the facility except for the required safety beacons on the cooling towers. Dispatch came back on the radio. Unit 23, patch through to NRC Incident Command, channel 7 inches. I switched to the Federal Coordination Channel. NRC Command, this is Millfield County Sheriff's Unit 23. Reporting confirmed breach at Hartwell Facility, Gate 7. The voice that responded was crisp, professional, and awake despite the hour. Unit 23, this is Agent Madison Torres, NRC Emergency Response. Please confirm, forced entry at Gate 7, multiple subjects observed inside perimeter. Confirmed. Security contractor reported 4 subjects with lights moving from cooling tower area toward admin building approximately 20 minutes ago. We have visual confirmation of gate breach. Unit 23, you are authorized to conduct perimeter containment, but do not enter restricted zone. Repeat, maintain position outside federal boundary. We're dispatching a response team from regional office. ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes. In law enforcement, that's an eternity when you're dealing with trespassers who might be looking for trouble. Blake was scanning the facility with night vision scope we kept in the patrol unit. "Sarge," he called softly. "Movement. 2 o'clock from the admin building." I took the scope. There, maybe half a mile inside the perimeter, I could see 2 distinct figures moving between the smaller outbuildings. They were moving deliberately, not like lost hikers or kids on a dare. They moved like they knew where they were going. Dispatch, Unit 23. Visual contact with subjects inside facility. 2 individuals moving southeast from administrative area toward what appears to be the utility building complex. Copy, Unit 23. NRC response team advised of current subject location. We maintained observation for another 15 minutes. The subjects disappeared behind the utility buildings and didn't emerge. Blake suggested we reposition to get a better angle, but I held us at the gate. Protocol was protocol, especially when dealing with a nuclear facility. At 12:34 a.m., we heard the sound. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the ambient noise of our idling patrol units. But it grew stronger, more distinct. It was mechanical, rhythmic, like heavy machinery cycling on and off. "Blake, you hear that?" He nodded. "Sounds like it's coming from inside the facility, maybe the main building?" That wasn't possible. The facility had been powered down for 8 years. All mechanical systems had been shut down and secured. Even the backup generators had been removed as part of the decommissioning process. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. At 12:52 a.m., we saw the lights. They weren't flashlights this time. They were fixed lights, illuminating windows in the main reactor building. Multiple windows, multiple floors, as if someone had restored power to entire sections of the facility. I radioed it in immediately. NRC Command, Unit 23. Facility showing internal lighting. Repeat, lights are active inside main reactor building. Agent Torres responded within seconds. Unit 23, confirm what you're observing. Lights inside the reactor building? Confirmed. Multiple windows. Appears to be floors 2 and 3 of the main structure. Lights came on approximately 2 minutes ago. There was a long pause before Torres came back on the radio. Unit 23, we're accelerating response. Additional units en route. Continue to maintain perimeter. Under no circumstances should you enter the restricted zone. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. By 1:15 a.m., the NRC response team arrived. 3 black SUVs with federal plates and enough personnel to secure a small city. Agent Torres was exactly what you'd expect from Federal Emergency Response. Calm, professional, and clearly in charge. She briefed me quickly. The facility had been completely disconnected from the electrical grid in 2012. There were no operational power sources inside the perimeter. The backup systems had been physically removed. Whatever was generating those lights shouldn't be possible. Sergeant Logan, she said, we need your local knowledge. In your experience patrolling this area, have you ever observed any similar activity? I thought back through 2 years of routine perimeter checks. No, ma'am. Never seen lights, never heard machinery. The facility has been completely dark since I started this rotation. What about the trespassers? Local kids? Urban explorers? It happens occasionally. Usually we catch them at the fence before they get inside. This is the first time we've had multiple subjects reach the interior structures. Agent Torres nodded. We're going to need you and Officer Blake to maintain your position here while our team conducts interior sweep. If these subjects attempt to exit through Gate 7, detain them for federal processing. The NRC team entered the facility at 1:23 a.m. We watched through binoculars as their convoy moved along the access road toward the main complex. Their vehicles had multiple light bars and what appeared to be specialized equipment we couldn't identify from our position. For the next hour, Blake and I maintained watch at the gate. The lights inside the reactor building remained on. We could see the NRC team's vehicles positioned around the main building, but we couldn't observe their actual search operations. At 2:31 a.m., the lights went out. All of them, simultaneously. The reactor building returned to complete darkness. 3 minutes later, Agent Torres radioed us. Unit 23, Federal team is conducting facility. Lockdown. Maintain position for debriefing. Copy. Any subjects located? Stand by for debriefing. That was Federal speak for, I'm not telling you over an open channel. The NRC team exited the facility at 3:45 a.m. Agent Torres approached our position with an expression that told me she hadn't found what she was looking for. Sergeant Logan, we found clear evidence that multiple individuals had been inside the facility. Footprints, disturbed dust patterns, evidence of forced entry into several secured areas. But no subjects were located. They got out another way? That's what we're trying to determine. The facility has multiple exit points, but all are supposed to be secured. We'll be conducting a complete perimeter audit over the next several days. Blake spoke up. What about the power? The lights we saw? Torres exchanged a look with one of her colleagues. We're investigating that as well. There's no apparent explanation for the electrical activity you observed. She handed me a business card. If you observe any further unusual activity during your patrols, any activity at all, contact me immediately, day or night. The Federal team secured Gate 7 with new locks and additional warning signs. They left at 4:12 a.m. Blake and I completed our patrol route and returned to the station by 6 a.m. I filed a detailed incident report, including all radio communications, observations, and Federal coordination. Standard procedure for any incident involving Federal property. But as I wrote that report, I kept thinking about those lights. Not just that they had been on, but the way they had illuminated the reactor building. It hadn't looked random or improvised. It had looked systematic, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly which systems to activate. And there was something else bothering me. Something Agent Torres hadn't mentioned. When the federal team had entered the facility, I'd been watching through binoculars. Their convoy had consisted of 3 vehicles with approximately 12 personnel, but when they exited nearly 2 hours later, I had counted only 11 people. I didn't mention it in my report. Maybe I had miscounted in the dark. Maybe one of their team had remained inside for additional security. Maybe it didn't matter. But as I drove home that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something that was supposed to stay hidden, and that our routine perimeter check had just become anything but routine. The next night, I was assigned to the same patrol route. Same sector, same schedule, same twice-nightly check of the Hartwell facility perimeter. I drove past Gate 7 at 10:45 p.m. New federal locks were in place. No signs of disturbance. The facility was dark and silent, but as I continued along the perimeter road, I noticed something I had never seen before in 2 years of these patrols. Fresh tire tracks in the soft shoulder near Gate 3. Multiple vehicles, recent enough that the tread patterns were still clear in the dirt. Gate 3 was supposed to be permanently sealed. It had been welded shut as part of the decommissioning process. I stopped and examined the gate with my flashlight. The welds had been cut. Recently, professional work, clean cuts, just like at Gate 7. I radioed for backup and called Agent Torres. Agent Torres arrived at Gate 3 within 30 minutes, accompanied by 2 other federal agents I hadn't seen the night before. She examined the cut welds with a professional efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first time dealing with facility breaches. "How long since you last checked this gate, Sergeant Logan?" she asked, photographing the cuts with what appeared to be a specialized camera. "Day before yesterday, everything was secure then." I pointed to my patrol log. I document every gate check. Gate 3 was intact as of Monday night, 11:23 p.m. So, this breach occurred within the last 48 hours. She exchanged looks with her colleagues. Possibly while we were responding to the Gate 7 incident. Blake had arrived as backup and was conducting a perimeter sweep with his flashlight. "Sarge," he called from about 20 yards down the fence line. "You need to see this." We approached his position. He was illuminating a section of fence that had been carefully cut and reattached. The wire had been snipped in a perfect rectangle, large enough for a person to crawl through, then twisted back together to appear intact from a distance. "Professional work," one of the other federal agents commented. "Someone with bolt cutters and experience." Torres was making notes in a field book. "Sergeant, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. In your patrol experience around this facility, have you ever observed any patterns of unusual activity? Anything that might seem routine now, but struck you as odd at the time?" I considered the question. 2 years of night patrols, hundreds of perimeter checks. Most of it blurred together into routine radio calls and incident reports. But as I thought back, a few things began to stand out. "There's been an increase in animal activity," I said slowly. "Over the past 6 months or so. Dead deer along the access road, more than usual. I assumed it was natural causes, maybe disease. What kind of numbers are we talking about?" "Maybe 1 or 2 per month before last fall. Since then, I'd say 6 or 7 total. All found within half a mile of the perimeter." Torres made another note. "Anything else?" "Equipment failures. My patrol unit's radio goes dead in certain spots along the fence line. GPS gets glitchy. I reported it to our IT department, but they said the electronics check out fine." Blake spoke up. Same thing happens to me, usually near the north section, around gates 5 and 6. Show me, Torres said. We drove the perimeter road in convoy, 2 federal SUVs and our patrol units. At gate 5, my radio started crackling with static. By gate 6, it was completely dead. The GPS showed us stopped in the middle of an empty field, despite being clearly visible on a paved road. Torres had her own communications equipment in her SUV, federal gear, presumably more sophisticated than our county-issued radios. But as we approached the same section of fence line, I could hear her communications degrading as well. "How long has this been happening?" she asked when we regrouped at gate 7. I first noticed it maybe 4 months ago, reported it up the chain, but since it only affects this specific area, nobody seemed too concerned. We just work around it. Torres was quiet for several minutes, studying her notes and consulting with her colleagues. Finally, she turned back to me. "Sergeant Logan, I'm going to share some information with you, but I need your agreement that this conversation stays between law enforcement personnel. Not your department, not your wife, not your partner unless he's directly involved in ongoing patrol activities." I nodded. Blake did the same. We've been tracking similar incidents at decommissioned nuclear facilities across 3 states. Perimeter breaches, unexplained electrical activity, equipment failures in the vicinity of restricted zones. What you're describing fits a pattern we've been investigating for almost a year. What kind of pattern? Someone with advanced technical knowledge has been accessing these facilities. Not random trespassers, not urban explorers. People who know how to bypass security systems, how to restore power to supposedly dead facilities, and how to avoid detection. Blake leaned against his patrol unit. Any idea what they're after? That's what we're trying to determine. These facilities still contain significant amounts of nuclear material, even in decommissioned state. Fuel rods, contaminated equipment, radioactive waste in various stages of storage. All of it is supposed to be secure, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "What do you need from us?" I asked. "Continue your normal patrol schedule, but I want you to document everything. Every equipment failure, every dead animal, every unusual sound or observation, no matter how minor it seems. And if you observe any activity inside the perimeter, any activity at all, I want you to call me immediately before you call dispatch." She handed me a secure communication device. "This will reach me directly, encrypted channel. Use it if you see anything unusual." We wrapped up at gate 3 by 2:30 a.m. The federal team installed new security measures. Not just locks, but sensors that would trigger if the gate was opened. They did the same at gates 5 and 6. The next week passed without incident. Normal patrols, normal radio checks, normal documentation. The secure comm device Torres had given me remained silent. But on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the Gate 7 incident, things escalated. I was conducting my routine 11 p.m. perimeter check when I noticed lights inside the facility again. Not in the reactor building this time, but in one of the smaller administrative structures near the cooling towers. Just 2 windows on the ground floor, but the light was steady and artificial, not flashlights or candles. I used Torres's communication device immediately. She answered on the second ring. "Agent Torres, this is Sergeant Logan. I've got lights inside the facility again. Administrative building near the cooling towers. Confirmed lights? Not reflections or shadows? Confirmed. 2 windows, ground floor, steady artificial light. Do not approach the perimeter. Maintain observation from public road. We're en route." I called for backup and positioned myself with binoculars. The lights remained on for 18 minutes, then went dark just as the federal response team arrived. This time, Torres brought a larger team. 8 agents, specialized equipment, and what appeared to be a mobile command center. They established a perimeter outside the facility and began preparations for another internal sweep. "Sergeant, we're going to try something different tonight," Torres explained. "My team is going to maintain positions at all exit points while a smaller unit enters through Gate 7. If anyone is inside, we're going to contain them." The operation began at 1:15 a.m. I watched through binoculars as 4 agents entered the facility and began moving toward the administrative building where I had observed the lights. For nearly an hour, everything proceeded normally. The agents methodically searched building by building, communicating through their radio network. Then, at 2:23 a.m., something happened that I still don't have an adequate explanation for. The cooling towers began to emit sound. Not the mechanical humming we had heard the week before, but something different. A low-frequency vibration that you felt as much as heard. It started quietly but grew stronger, until it was audible even from our position half a mile away. Torres was immediately on her radio, trying to reach the internal team. No response. The secure communication channels that had been working perfectly just minutes before were now completely silent. "Blake," I said, "do you hear that?" The sound from the cooling towers had changed. It was no longer a steady vibration, but a pulsing rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, if a heartbeat could be amplified through concrete and steel. Torres made a command decision. "We're going in. Full team, all entry points." But as her backup units approached the facility gates, every vehicle suffered simultaneous electrical failure. Engines died, radios went silent. Even their flashlights stopped working. The only equipment still functioning was our patrol units, positioned further from the perimeter. The sound from the cooling towers reached its peak and then stopped. Abruptly. Complete silence. Torres's communications came back online immediately. Her internal team responded within seconds. "Command, this is Alpha Team. We're at the administrative building. No subjects located, but we've got a situation here. You need to see this." 20 minutes later, the internal team emerged from the facility. Torres approached my position with an expression that was equal parts confusion and concern. "Sergeant Logan, my team found evidence of extensive electrical work inside that administrative building. Recently installed wiring, power distribution panels, computer equipment, professional-grade installation. Someone's been setting up operations inside the facility. It appears that way, but here's what doesn't make sense. The work they found, the electrical installation, the computer systems, it's all connected to the facility's original power grid. I thought that was shut down. It was 8 years ago. But someone has been systematically reactivating sections of the nuclear plant's electrical systems. Not just jerry-rigging power from outside sources, but actually restoring the original infrastructure." Blake looked up from his incident report. "Why would someone want to do that?" Torres was quiet for a long moment. "There are only a few reasons someone would need that level of power access in a nuclear facility, and none of them are good." She gathered her team and prepared to leave, but before getting into her vehicle, she approached me one more time. "Sergeant, I need you to understand something. What we're dealing with here isn't simple trespassing or vandalism. Someone with significant technical expertise and resources is conducting operations inside this facility. Operations that could have serious consequences if they're not stopped." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that could affect a lot more than just Millfield County." After the federal team left, Blake and I completed our patrol route in relative silence. We were both processing what we had witnessed, the coordinated equipment failures, the sounds from the cooling towers, the evidence of ongoing operations inside a supposedly secure nuclear facility. As we prepared our incident reports back at the station, Blake asked the question that had been bothering me as well. Sarge, if someone wanted to access nuclear material, wouldn't it be easier to hit a facility that's still operational? Why focus on one that's been shut down? It was a good question. Operational facilities have security, but they also have oversight. People coming and going, regular inspections, active monitoring systems. A decommissioned facility, on the other hand, sits in bureaucratic limbo. Minimal security, infrequent inspections, and most importantly, lower expectations for unusual activity. If someone wanted to conduct long-term operations involving nuclear material, a shutdown facility might actually be the perfect cover. But as I filed my report that night, I realized there was another possibility that was even more disturbing. What if they weren't trying to steal nuclear material from the facility? What if they were trying to bring nuclear material into it? The call came in during my Friday night shift, 3 days after the electrical equipment discovery. Dispatch's voice carried an unusual tension as it crackled through my radio. Unit 23, respond to mile marker 47 on County Route 15. Report a vehicle accident with possible fatalities. County Route 15 runs directly past the Hartwell facility's eastern boundary. Mile marker 47 puts you within sight of the cooling towers. Unit 23 copy, en route. ETA 8 minutes. I called for additional units and EMS, standard protocol for any accident with potential fatalities. But as I approached the scene, what I found wasn't what I expected. A late-model sedan had left the roadway and struck a utility pole with enough force to snap the pole in half. The vehicle had rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in the drainage ditch, but there were no skid marks on the pavement, no signs of evasive action or attempted braking. It looked like the driver had simply lost consciousness and maintained speed until impact. EMS arrived as I was examining the scene. The driver was a male, mid-30s, unconscious but alive. No obvious trauma from the accident, but his vital signs were weak and erratic. The EMTs couldn't stabilize him at the scene. "Sergeant Logan," the lead paramedic called out. "We need to transport immediately. His heart rhythm is all over the place, and we're getting some unusual readings." As they loaded him into the ambulance, I conducted a preliminary search of the vehicle. Standard procedure for any accident investigation. His wallet identified him as Ryan Mitchell, address in Springfield, about 40 miles north. Vehicle registration matched, no outstanding warrants. But in the back seat, I found something that made me immediately think of Agent Torres. A radiation detection device, professional grade, not the kind of equipment you buy at an electronics store. It was still powered on, and the display showed readings that meant nothing to me, but I knew they weren't normal background levels. I secured the device as evidence and radioed Torres using the encrypted communication device she had given me. "Agent Torres, this is Sergeant Logan. I've got a situation that may be related to our facility concerns." "Go ahead, Sergeant." I briefed her on the accident, and the driver's condition, and the radiation detector. She was silent for several seconds after I finished. "Sergeant, I need you to secure that scene immediately. Don't let anyone else approach the vehicle until we arrive. And whatever you do, don't handle that radiation device without protective equipment." "Understood. How long until you get here?" 20 minutes. And Sergeant, you said there were no skid marks?" "Correct. No evidence of braking or evasive action." Another pause. "We'll be there soon." Torres arrived with a full hazmat team. They approached the accident scene wearing protective suits and carrying equipment I didn't recognize. After a thorough examination of the vehicle and the surrounding area, they confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The accident site was contaminated with radioactive material. "Low-level exposure," Torres explained as her team worked to contain the area. not immediately dangerous, but definitely above background levels. The driver was likely exposed to much higher levels before the accident. You think he was inside the facility? It's possible. Or he encountered someone who had been inside. She held up an evidence bag containing the radiation detector. This is expensive equipment, Sergeant. The kind used for detecting specific isotopes in controlled environments. Blake arrived to assist with scene security as Torres's team established a contamination perimeter around the accident site. The entire area was cordoned off with hazmat tape, and specialized crews began decontamination procedures. "What about the driver?" I asked. "He's been transferred to a facility equipped to handle radiation exposure cases. If he survives, we'll want to question him about where he's been and what he was doing with that detection equipment." As the hazmat team worked, I noticed something troubling. Several members of Torres's crew were paying particular attention to the utility pole that had been struck in the accident. They were taking samples from the broken wood and photographing the electrical lines that had been severed. "Agent Torres," I called out, "is there something special about that power line?" She approached my position, pulling back her hazmat hood. "That's not just any utility line, Sergeant. It's part of the dedicated power grid that used to supply the Hartwell facility." I thought the facility was disconnected from the main grid. It was, but there are backup power connections, emergency circuits that were supposed to be physically severed during decommissioning. If someone wanted to restore full power to the facility, they'd need to reactivate those circuits. I looked back at the broken pole. "You think he was trying to cut the power or restore it?" Either way, he was working on infrastructure that's directly connected to the nuclear facility. The decontamination work continued for nearly 4 hours. By sunrise, Torres's team had collected samples from the accident site, the vehicle, and a quarter-mile radius around the impact point. All of it showed traces of radioactive contamination. "Sergeant Logan," Torres said as her team prepared to leave, "I need to brief you on some developments. Things are moving faster than we anticipated." We met privately at my patrol unit, while Blake maintained scene security. "We've been monitoring communication intercepts related to the facility breaches," she began. "Encrypted radio traffic, cellular communications, internet activity. 3 days ago, we detected a significant increase in coded communications originating from this area." "What kind of communications?" "Technical discussions about nuclear material handling, transportation logistics, and something called Project Cooling Tower. We don't know what that refers to, but based on the context, it involves moving substantial amounts of radioactive material." A cold realization was beginning to form in my mind. "Agent Torres, when nuclear facilities are decommissioned, what happens to all the radioactive waste?" "Most of it is moved to secure storage facilities, but some lower-level material is stored on site in specially designed containers until permanent disposal arrangements can be made." "How much material are we talking about?" "At Hartwell? Approximately 200 tons of various radioactive waste, plus spent fuel rods that are still cooling in storage pools. 200 tons. Enough to contaminate thousands of square miles if it was deliberately dispersed." "There's something else," Torres continued. "Hospital reports from the Springfield area show a pattern of patients presenting with symptoms consistent with low-level radiation exposure. 7 cases over the past 2 weeks, all dismissed as food poisoning or flu-like illnesses, but the symptoms match radiation sickness." "Same area where our accident victim lives?" "Exactly. We think there's a network of people who have been entering the facility regularly, possibly removing material and becoming contaminated in the process." Blake approached our position, looking concerned. "Sarge, I just got a call from dispatch. They want us to respond to another accident on County Route 15. about 2 miles north of here. Torres and I exchanged looks. Same kind of accident? I asked. Sounds like it. Single vehicle, left the roadway for no apparent reason, driver unconscious. Torres was already on her radio, calling for additional hazmat teams. Sergeant, I think we've got a serious problem. If people are becoming incapacitated due to radiation exposure while driving. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. We weren't just dealing with trespassing or theft. We were dealing with people who were so badly contaminated they were losing consciousness behind the wheel of vehicles. The second accident scene confirmed our fears. Another single vehicle collision, another unconscious driver, and another radiation detector in the vehicle. This time, the contamination levels were even higher. By noon, Torres had established a mobile command post at the County Emergency Services building. Federal agencies I'd never heard of were coordinating with state and local authorities. The situation had escalated beyond a simple trespassing case. Sergeant Logan, Torres called me over to the command post. We need local knowledge for the next phase of our operation. Tonight, we're going to conduct a full-scale raid on the Hartwell facility. You know who's responsible. We have a good idea. The communication intercepts led us to a group that's been planning something called a radiological dispersal event. Based on the timeline we've reconstructed, they've been systematically removing nuclear material from the facility for weeks. The term radiological dispersal event is law enforcement speak for a dirty bomb. What do you need from me? You know this area better than anyone. Roads, terrain, escape routes. If this group tries to run when we move on them, they'll probably head for familiar territory. Torres spread out a tactical map of the area surrounding the Hartwell facility. It showed not just the roads I patrolled regularly, but dozens of secondary routes, farm roads, and off-road trails. Based on our intelligence, they're planning to move their operation tonight. Large-scale transportation of nuclear material, probably to a secondary location where they can assemble whatever device they're building. Blake joined our planning session. How much material are we talking about? Enough to contaminate downtown Springfield if dispersed properly, or Chicago, if that's their target. The magnitude of what we were dealing with hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about catching trespassers anymore. This was about preventing a radiological attack that could kill thousands of people and render entire city blocks uninhabitable for decades. Torres outlined the tactical plan. Federal agents would breach the facility from multiple entry points while local law enforcement established containment around the entire perimeter. Anyone attempting to flee the area would be intercepted and detained. Remember, she emphasized, anyone involved in this operation has been exposed to significant levels of radiation. They may be disoriented, irrational, or physically incapacitated, and any vehicles or equipment they're using should be considered contaminated until proven otherwise. The operation was scheduled to begin at 2 a.m. That gave us 8 hours to position personnel, coordinate communications, and prepare for what Torres described as a complex tactical situation with potential for mass casualties. As I prepared to brief my own department on their role in the operation, I couldn't help thinking about those 2 accident victims. They had been so contaminated that they'd lost consciousness while driving. If they were working with nuclear material that was that dangerous, what were they planning to do with it? And more importantly, how much of it had they already moved out of the facility? By 1:45 a.m., law enforcement personnel were positioned at every road, trail, and possible escape route within a 5-mile radius of the Hartwell facility. Blake and I were assigned to monitor the main access road, the most likely route for any vehicles attempting to leave the area. Torres's voice came over the tactical radio channel at exactly 2 a.m. All units, this is Command. Operation Cooling Tower is now active. Entry teams are breaching the facility. Through binoculars, we could see the federal assault teams entering the facility from multiple points. Their vehicles moved with precision, following predetermined routes toward the main reactor building and cooling towers. For the first 15 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. The entry teams reported finding extensive evidence of ongoing operations inside the facility, vehicles, equipment, and what appeared to be improvised laboratories in several buildings. Then, at 2:17 a.m., everything changed. "All units, this is Alpha Team," came the urgent radio transmission. "We've got a situation inside the facility. The nuclear material storage area has been completely cleared out. Repeat, all stored nuclear waste has been removed from the facility." Torres's response was immediate. "Confirm that report, Alpha Team." "Confirmed, Command." Storage containers have been opened and emptied. Based on the residual contamination, this happened recently, within the last 24 hours. Blake and I looked at each other. If 200 tons of radioactive material had been moved out of the facility in the last day, where was it now? The answer came at 2:31 a.m., when every radiation detector in the county began screaming alarms simultaneously. The radiation alarms weren't coming from inside the Hartwell facility. They were coming from everywhere else. Torres's command post erupted in controlled chaos as reports flooded in from monitoring stations across 3 counties. Elevated radiation levels at the Springfield airport. Contamination detected at the Interstate 70 truck stops. Radioactive signatures at a dozen locations throughout the region. "Command, this is Bravo Team," crackled over the tactical radio. "We're inside the main reactor building. The facility is clean. Repeat, no radioactive material detected inside the facility." Blake grabbed my arm. "Sarge, if the material isn't at the facility and it's showing up everywhere else..." I understood immediately. We hadn't been trying to stop people from stealing nuclear material from Hartwell. We'd been trying to stop them from using Hartwell as a distribution center for material they'd already acquired somewhere else. Torres's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All units were dealing with a coordinated dispersal event. The facility was being used as a staging area, not a source. Maintain containment while we assess the full scope of contamination." Over the next hour, the picture became terrifyingly clear. The group hadn't been stealing nuclear waste from the decommissioned facility. They'd been bringing in much more dangerous material from outside sources. Spent fuel from medical facilities, industrial radioactive sources, possibly even weapons-grade material, and using the Hartwell facility's restored electrical systems to process it into dozens of smaller, more easily transported packages. "Sergeant Logan," Torres called me to the mobile command post. "We need your help with something. Based on the contamination pattern we're seeing, this material was moved using the local road network. Multiple vehicles, multiple trips, all within the past 48 hours. She showed me a map with red dots marking every location where radiation had been detected. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. A distribution network centered on the Hartwell facility, with contaminated routes extending in all directions. They used the facility to prepare the material, then distributed it to predetermined locations throughout the region, Torres explained. Some kind of coordinated attack plan. Blake studied the map. But why spread it out like this? If they wanted to cause maximum damage, wouldn't they concentrate it in one location? Torres's expression was grim. Not if their goal was area denial rather than casualties. Look at the pattern again. I looked more carefully at the contamination sites. They weren't random. They formed a rough circle around the major population center of Springfield, with additional sites along interstate highways and near critical infrastructure. They're trying to create a contamination zone, I realized. Not a single point of attack, but a widespread area that becomes uninhabitable. Exactly. And if our analysis is correct, they're not done yet. This appears to be the first phase of a larger operation. At 4:15 a.m., we got confirmation of what Torres feared most. Intelligence intercepts indicated that the group responsible for the contamination had acquired enough nuclear material to create not just area denial, but what analysts termed a persistent radiological hazard affecting multiple states. The scope of the operation was beyond anything local law enforcement was equipped to handle. Federal agencies from Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had taken operational control. My role, and Blake's, had been reduced to providing local support and maintaining perimeter security. But at 5:23 a.m., that changed. Unit 23, this is Agent Torres. We need you to respond to a possible sighting at the old Millerstown grain elevator, Route 34 and Township Road 12. I knew the location. An abandoned agricultural facility about 8 miles northeast of the Hartwell plant. It had been closed for years, another casualty of economic changes that had left much of rural Millfield County dotted with empty buildings. What kind of sighting? I radioed back. Local resident reported seeing multiple vehicles and unusual activity around the grain elevator complex. Given the contamination pattern, it could be another distribution site. Blake and I responded Code 2. Urgent, but no lights or sirens. We didn't want to spook anyone who might be in the area. The grain elevator complex consisted of several large storage silos, a main processing building, and various outbuildings scattered across about 20 acres. As we approached, I could see tire tracks in the gravel parking area. Multiple vehicles, recent activity. Unit 23 to Agent Torres. I radioed using the encrypted device. We've got evidence of recent activity at the grain elevator. Multiple vehicle tracks, and some of the buildings show signs of recent entry. Copy, Unit 23. We're dispatching a hazmat team to your location. Do not enter any buildings until they arrive. But as we were waiting for backup, Blake noticed something that made the situation more urgent. Sarge, look at the main silo. I followed his gaze. There, about 60 feet up on the side of the largest storage silo, someone had installed what appeared to be a radio antenna. Not the kind of equipment you'd expect to find on an abandoned agricultural building. Torres, we've got communications equipment installed on one of the structures. Looks recent. Sergeant, I need you to maintain visual observation, but do not approach the buildings. We're reading elevated radiation levels from your location. Elevated radiation levels. We were too late. Whatever the group had been doing at the grain elevator, they'd already contaminated the site. Over the next 2 hours, Torres's hazmat team confirmed what we suspected. The grain elevator had been converted into a sophisticated processing and communications center. The silos had been used to store and package nuclear material, while the main building contained computer equipment for coordinating the distribution operation. But, like the Hartwell facility, the grain elevator was now empty. Whatever had been stored there had been moved. Sergeant, Torres approached our position after her team had cleared the buildings. We found something inside that you need to know about. She handed me a printed document, protected in an evidence bag. It appeared to be a schedule or timeline, with dates, times, and location codes. What am I looking at? It's their operational plan. Phase 1 was the contamination we've been tracking, spreading low-level material throughout the region to create initial panic and force evacuations. Phase 2, which was supposed to begin this morning, involves much more dangerous material. I scanned the document. Most of it was in coded language I didn't understand, but one section was clear enough. Primary target, Springfield Municipal Water Treatment Facility. Secondary targets, interstate highway bridges, grain processing facilities. They're going after the water supply, among other targets. If they contaminate the municipal water system with the kind of high-level material we think they've acquired, it could render the entire city uninhabitable for decades. Blake was studying the timeline. According to this, Phase 2 was supposed to start at 6 a.m. That's 30 minutes ago. Torres was already on her radio, coordinating with federal agencies across the state. But as she worked to establish protective measures around potential targets, I realized something that made the situation even more desperate. The document Blake was reading wasn't in past tense. It was a live operational plan. And according to the timestamps, the group wasn't just planning Phase 2, they were currently executing it. Agent Torres, I interrupted her radio conversation. This document shows current operations. If it's accurate, they've already deployed teams to multiple targets. She snatched the document back, reading more carefully. Sergeant, we need to move immediately. Based on this timeline, they've got teams en route to the water treatment plant and at least 3 other critical infrastructure sites. The next 6 hours were a blur of coordinated emergency response. State and federal agencies mobilized to protect potential targets, while hazmat teams rushed to locate and contain the radioactive material before it could be deployed. Blake and I were assigned to assist with the water treatment plant operation. When we arrived, federal agents were already on scene, but they'd found something disturbing. The facility's security systems had been compromised days earlier, and there was evidence that someone had conducted detailed reconnaissance of the water processing systems. They've been planning this for weeks, the lead federal agent explained. Maybe months. This isn't random terrorism. This is a sophisticated operation designed to maximize long-term contamination. By noon, emergency teams had located and contained radioactive material at 4 of the 6 target sites listed in the operational plan. But 2 sites remained active, the Interstate Bridge Complex and an unspecified agricultural target that hadn't been identified. At 2:17 p.m., we got the call that every law enforcement officer dreads. All units, we have confirmation of radiological dispersal at the Route 35 bridge over Mill Creek. Repeat, we have an active contamination event. The Route 35 bridge carried interstate traffic between Springfield and 3 other major cities. If it had been contaminated, thousands of vehicles had already passed through the area, carrying radioactive material to dozens of other locations. Torres's voice came over the tactical channel with barely controlled urgency. All units, we're implementing full regional containment. No traffic in or out of the contamination zone until we can assess the scope of dispersal. Blake and I were assigned to establish a checkpoint on Highway 50, one of the primary routes out of the region. Our job was to monitor all vehicles for radioactive contamination and detain anyone showing elevated levels. For the next 8 hours, we tested nearly 300 vehicles. 12 tested positive for contamination. The occupants were transferred to decontamination facilities, their vehicles impounded as evidence. But as evening approached, it became clear that our containment efforts had only limited the spread of contamination, not stopped it entirely. The group's distribution network had been too extensive, their planning too thorough. By nightfall, radiation monitoring stations across 4 states were detecting elevated levels. The contamination zone encompassed nearly 200 square miles, with thousands of people potentially exposed. Torres found me at the checkpoint as we prepared to end our shift. She looked exhausted, but her professional composure remained intact. Sergeant Logan, I wanted to update you on what we've learned. The group responsible for this operation has been planning it for almost 2 years. They used the Hartwell facility as a cover, while they acquired nuclear material from multiple sources, medical facilities, industrial sites, possibly even foreign sources. Any idea why they targeted this area? We think it was partly geographic, central location, major transportation routes, sparse population that would make their preparatory activities less noticeable. But there's something else. She paused, as if deciding how much to share. The contamination pattern they created isn't random. It's designed to force long-term evacuation of specific areas while leaving others habitable. Almost like they were trying to reshape the demographic and economic map of the region. Reshape it how? We're still analyzing that. But the areas they contaminated were primarily rural, agricultural, and working-class communities. The areas they avoided were more affluent, more politically connected. Blake joined our conversation. So, this wasn't just terrorism, it was social engineering. Torres nodded. That's our working theory, but we may never know for certain. The core group appears to have dispersed after the operation. We've arrested 17 people, but most of them were low-level participants who didn't understand the full scope of what they were involved in. As Torres prepared to leave, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the operation began. Agent Torres, are we going to be able to clean this up? Is the area going to be habitable again? She was quiet for a long moment. Some of it eventually, but other areas, the contamination is too extensive, too deeply embedded in the soil and water systems. Some of these communities are going to have to be permanently evacuated. Permanently evacuated. Entire towns, farms, businesses, gone forever because of a carefully planned radiological attack that we'd been too late to prevent. 6 months later, I transferred to a different patrol area. The Hartwell facility and most of the surrounding region had been declared a federal exclusion zone. No civilian access, no economic activity, no permanent residence. Blake took early retirement and moved to another state. He said he couldn't handle the thought that we'd been so close to preventing the contamination, but hadn't understood what we were really dealing with until it was too late. I still drive past the exclusion zone sometimes, on my way to other patrol areas. The cooling towers are still visible from several miles away, standing like monuments over an empty landscape that used to be home to thousands of people. The official reports called it a limited radiological incident with contained regional impact. But for those of us who lived through it, who watched entire communities disappear behind federal barriers and contamination warnings, it was something else entirely. It was proof that sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden deep underground or behind layers of security clearance. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, in facilities we drive past every day, protected only by chain-link fences and the assumption that someone else is watching. And sometimes, by the time we realize what we're really looking at, it's already too late to stop what's been set in motion. Some nights on patrol, the radio stays quiet for hours. Other nights, it never stops crackling. But there's a third kind of night, the kind where you get one call that changes everything you thought you knew about your jurisdiction. This happened on a Thursday in October 2018. I was working the midnight shift for the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, covering the eastern sector that includes the old Pemberton Army ammunition plant. The facility had been decommissioned since 1995, but it still sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of restricted federal land. Chain-link fences, warning signs, and enough unexploded ordnance left over from World War II to keep most people far away. My name is Deputy Mason Torres, and I'd been patrolling this sector for 7 years, long enough to know that the Pemberton site generated maybe 2 calls per year, usually teenagers trying to get inside on a dare, or hunters who'd wandered too close to the perimeter fence. But this call was different. Dispatch came over the radio at 1:23 a.m. with a tone I'd never heard before. Unit 47. Respond to a possible explosion at the Pemberton facility. Grid reference 7 Alpha. Multiple callers reporting a bright flash and ground vibration felt up to 5 miles away. I keyed up immediately. Unit 47 copies. En route to Pemberton. Requesting additional units and fire department response. Unit 47, be advised, facility is federal restricted area. Contact Army Corps of Engineers before entering perimeter. Copy. ETA 8 minutes. As I drove toward the facility, I could see what the callers had reported. There was a glow on the horizon, not like a building fire, but more like industrial welding multiplied by a factor of 10. And there was something else, a smell in the air that I couldn't identify. Metallic, sharp, like the air after lightning strikes. I reached the main gate at 1:31 a.m. The facility entrance was secured with the same locks and barriers it had carried for 23 years, but something was obviously wrong. The ground around the gate showed fresh tire tracks. Multiple vehicles, heavy enough to leave deep impressions in the hard-packed dirt. Unit 19 arrived as backup. Deputy Alexis Kane, solid officer with military background. She'd worked EOD in Afghanistan before joining the sheriff's department, which made her the closest thing we had to an explosives expert. "Mason," she called out as she approached my position. "What's our protocol here? This is federal property with the known ordnance hazards." "I've got Army Corps on speed dial," I replied, pulling out my duty phone. "But look at that glow. If someone's inside setting off unexploded artillery shells, we might not have time to wait for federal response." Kane was examining the tire tracks with her flashlight. "These aren't random. Someone knew exactly where they were going. Look at the pattern. Multiple vehicles, coordinated entry, probably within the last few hours." I got through to the Army Corps emergency line on the second try. Major Tyler Richardson was the duty officer for the Pemberton site, and he was already aware of our situation. "Deputy Torres, we've got seismic sensors throughout the facility. Whatever happened in there registered at 2.3 on the Richter scale. That's not someone accidentally stepping on a landmine. Major, we've got evidence of multiple vehicles entering the facility. With your permission, we'd like to conduct a perimeter sweep to assess the situation." "Negative, Deputy. That facility contains approximately 400 tons of various unexploded ordnance, including mustard gas artillery shells from the 1940s. If someone is deliberately detonating material in there, I need you to maintain position until we can get a full hazmat team on site." Kane was monitoring our radio traffic. She approached me with her binoculars. "Mason, take a look at Section 7 Alpha. That's not just one explosion site." I took the binoculars and focused on the area where we'd seen the initial glow. What I observed made me immediately understand why Major Richardson was so concerned. There were at least 6 distinct light sources burning inside the facility perimeter. Not random fires, but controlled burns that appeared to be placed at specific locations throughout the complex. "Major Richardson, we've got visual confirmation of multiple ignition points inside the facility. This doesn't look accidental. Deputy Torres, I'm declaring this an incident of national security concern. Federal authority is now in effect. Maintain containment position until my team arrives." Kane and I established a perimeter outside the main gate and waited for federal backup. But as we monitored the situation, it became clear that whatever was happening inside the Pemberton facility was far more complex than simple vandalism or accidental detonation. At 2:15 a.m., we heard the sounds. Not explosions this time, but heavy machinery. Diesel engines, hydraulic systems, the kind of equipment you'd use for major construction or excavation work. Kane, are you hearing that? She was already documenting everything with her body camera. Sounds like they're operating heavy equipment in there. Excavators. Maybe dump trucks. Who the hell brings excavation equipment to an abandoned ammunition plant? Someone who knows what they're looking for and where to find it. Major Richardson arrived at 2:47 a.m. with a full Army EOD team and enough federal agents to occupy a small country. He briefed us quickly on the situation as his team prepared to enter the facility. Deputies, what we're dealing with here is potentially catastrophic. The Pemberton facility was used for ammunition production from 1942 to 1991. When it was decommissioned, cleanup crews removed the obvious hazards, but approximately 30% of the site remains contaminated with unexploded ordnance. Kane spoke up. Major, what kind of ordnance are we talking about? Artillery shells, mortar rounds, chemical weapons components, and approximately 50 tons of various explosive compounds in different stages of deterioration. Some of it is so unstable that ground vibration could trigger detonation. And someone is deliberately setting off explosions in there. That's what we need to determine. But there's another issue. Richardson pulled out a tactical map of the facility. Based on seismic readings, the explosions are occurring in a specific pattern. Grid sections 7 Alpha, 12 Bravo, 18 Charlie, and 23 Delta. Those aren't random locations. I studied the map. What's special about those areas? They're the former storage sites for our most dangerous materials. Chemical weapons, high explosive artillery shells, and experimental ordnance that was never fully documented. Kane and I exchanged looks. Someone wasn't just trespassing on federal property. They were systematically targeting the most hazardous areas of the facility, using controlled explosions to access materials that had been buried and forgotten for decades. Major, do you have any intelligence on who might be responsible for this? Richardson was quiet for a moment. We've been tracking increased interest in decommissioned military facilities over the past 18 months. Intelligence suggests that certain groups have been attempting to acquire military-grade explosives and chemical agents from abandoned installations. What kind of groups? The kind that see unused military ordnance as raw materials for their own purposes. At 3:20 a.m., Richardson's EOD team entered the facility using armored vehicles and full protective equipment. Kane and I maintained perimeter security while monitoring their radio communications. For the first hour, their reports were routine. Evidence of recent excavation, abandoned construction equipment, vehicle tracks leading deeper into the facility. Then, at 4:33 a.m., everything changed. Command, this is Alpha Team. We've reached Grid 7 Alpha. Whatever exploded here, it wasn't an accident. Someone built shaped charges specifically designed to breach the underground storage bunkers. Richardson responded immediately. Alpha Team, confirm what you're observing. Command, the bunkers have been systematically opened using demolition techniques that would require significant expertise, and the ordnance that was stored here, it's gone. Gone. Someone had used professional demolition techniques to break into underground bunkers and remove military ordnance that had been secured there for decades. Alpha Team, what's your assessment of the missing materials? Richardson's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before. Command, based on the bunker configurations and storage records, we're looking at approximately 200 artillery shells, various calibers, plus an unknown quantity of chemical agent containers. Professional excavation, professional demolition, professional transportation. Kane grabbed my arm. Mason, do you understand what this means? Someone just acquired enough military explosives to level downtown Riverside. I was already on the radio to my dispatcher. Unit 47 to dispatch, requesting immediate contact with FBI and Homeland Security. We've got a confirmed theft of military ordnance from federal property. But as I made that call, I realized we were dealing with something much worse than theft. The explosions we'd witnessed, the systematic targeting of specific storage areas, the heavy equipment. This wasn't opportunistic looting. This was a carefully planned operation that had been months in the making. "Major Richardson," I called out, "how long would it take to plan and execute something like this?" "Based on what my team is reporting, 6 months minimum, maybe longer. Someone would need detailed facility maps, knowledge of bunker locations, demolition expertise, heavy equipment, and transportation capability for several tons of ordnance. And they'd need to know that the facility was still storing this material, even though it was supposedly cleaned up decades ago." Richardson nodded grimly. "That's the most troubling part, Deputy. The storage locations they targeted were classified information. Officially, those bunkers didn't contain anything hazardous." Kane was monitoring the EOD team's radio traffic. "Mason, they're finding evidence of multiple entry points. This wasn't a single operation. Someone's been accessing this facility repeatedly over an extended period." At 5:15 a.m., Richardson's team made a discovery that transformed the situation from serious to catastrophic. "Command, Alpha Team. We've found the construction equipment that was abandoned inside the facility. 3 excavators, 2 dump trucks, and a specialized drilling rig. All stolen from various construction companies over the past 4 months. Alpha Team, any indicators of how the perpetrators exited the facility?" "Command, we've got tire tracks leading to the north fence line. Appears they cut through the perimeter at Grid 31 Echo and exited onto Township Road 847. Township Road 847. I knew that road well. It connected to the interstate highway system and provided access to major population centers throughout 3 states. Richardson made a command decision. All units were implementing immediate notification protocols. FBI, Homeland Security, ATF, and state authorities are being briefed on potential domestic terrorism incident involving stolen military ordnance. As federal agencies began coordinating their response, Kane and I were assigned to conduct area canvassing. Our job was to interview local residents, check for suspicious activity, and establish a timeline for when the ordnance theft might have begun. Our first stop was the Murphy farmhouse, located about 2 miles from the north fence line of the Pemberton facility. Frank Murphy had been farming that land for 40 years and knew every road, trail, and vehicle that didn't belong. "Officers," Murphy said as we approached his front porch, "I was wondering when someone would come by. Been hearing heavy trucks on Township Road for weeks now. Always at night, always moving toward the old Army base." Kane took notes while I questioned him. "Mr. Murphy, can you be more specific about the time frame? Started maybe 3 months ago. First couple times I figured it was construction equipment moving between job sites, but then I noticed they were always the same trucks, always the same route, and they never came back during daylight hours." "Did you get a look at the vehicles?" "Big trucks, tractor trailers, flatbeds, couple of those heavy equipment haulers you see moving bulldozers around. Professional operation, not some kids joking around." Kane asked, "Mr. Murphy, did you report this activity to anyone?" Murphy shook his head. "Didn't seem like my business. Figured it was legitimate work related to the Army base. Maybe cleanup operations or something." As we continued our canvassing, a pattern emerged. Multiple residents had observed regular heavy truck traffic on rural roads leading to and from the Pemberton facility. The activity had been ongoing for at least 3 months, always at night, always following the same routes. but nobody had reported it because it looked professional and legitimate. At 8:30 a.m., Kane and I received an urgent radio call from Major Richardson. Units 47 and 19, return to facility immediately. We've made a discovery that changes the scope of this investigation. We arrived to find Richardson coordinating with FBI agents and what appeared to be a specialized federal response team. The glow from inside the facility had dimmed, but we could still see smoke rising from several locations. Deputies, Richardson briefed us. My EOD team has completed preliminary assessment of the theft sites. What we're dealing with is worse than we initially thought. He spread out detailed facility maps with areas marked in red. The perpetrators didn't just target storage bunkers containing conventional ordnance. They specifically targeted the locations where we stored experimental weapons that were never officially documented. "What kind of experimental weapons?" Kane asked. "Chemical agents, incendiary compounds, and what our records euphemistically call area denial munitions. Weapons that were designed for battlefield use but never deployed because they were deemed too dangerous or too indiscriminate." I studied the marked locations on the map. "Major, how much of this experimental material was taken?" "Based on our preliminary inventory, approximately 400 pounds of various chemical agents, 50 incendiary devices, and an unknown quantity of explosive compounds that we can't fully identify because the documentation was classified above my clearance level. 400 pounds of military chemical weapons, enough to contaminate dozens of city blocks or poison municipal water supplies. But as troubling as that was, Richardson had more bad news. "Deputies, there's something else you need to know. The excavation work inside the facility was too sophisticated for a criminal organization. The demolition techniques, the precision targeting of specific storage areas, the knowledge of classified bunker locations, this required inside information." Kane looked up from her notes. "Inside information from who?" "Someone with access to classified facility records, detailed knowledge of hazardous materials storage, and the technical expertise to plan and execute a complex extraction operation." "You're talking about someone with military or federal background?" Richardson nodded. "Possibly someone who worked at this facility during active operations, or someone with current access to classified military records." As the magnitude of the situation began to sink in, I realized that we weren't just dealing with theft of military property. We were dealing with a sophisticated operation conducted by people with insider knowledge, access to specialized equipment, and the capability to transport and deploy some of the most dangerous weapons ever developed by the U.S. military. And they had a 3-month head start. "Major Richardson," I said, "what's the immediate threat assessment for civilian populations?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Deputy Torres, if the materials stolen from this facility were deployed against a population center using even basic dispersal methods, we could be looking at casualties in the thousands and long-term contamination that would require permanent evacuation of large areas." Kane and I exchanged looks. This wasn't just a law enforcement matter anymore. This was a potential weapon of mass destruction in the hands of people who had been planning this operation for months, and we had no idea where they were or what they planned to do with 400 pounds of military chemical weapons. The FBI established their command post in the parking lot of the Riverside County Community Center, about 5 miles from the Pemberton facility. By noon, it looked like a small military base. Mobile command units, satellite communications, hazmat teams, and enough federal agents to staff a small city. Special Agent Connor Walsh briefed Kane and me on our role in what was now officially designated as Operation Broken Arrow, the code name for incidents involving lost or stolen nuclear weapons. Except in this case, It was chemical weapons that had gone missing. "Deputies," Walsh explained, "we need your local knowledge and established relationships with area residents. This investigation is going to require extensive canvassing, background checks, and surveillance of anyone who might have had knowledge of or access to the Pemberton facility." Kane raised her hand. "Agent Walsh, what's our timeline for threat assessment? If these materials are going to be deployed, how long do we have?" "That depends on what they plan to do with them. If it's a simple dispersal attack, spraying chemical agents from a vehicle or aircraft, they could execute that immediately. If they're planning something more sophisticated, we might have weeks or months." I asked the question that had been bothering me since Richardson's briefing. "Agent Walsh, you mentioned that this required inside information. Are we looking at current or former military personnel?" Walsh consulted his notes. "We're investigating several possibilities. Former Pemberton facility employees, current military personnel with access to classified records, contractors involved in the decommissioning process, and federal employees with security clearance for military installations." "How many people are we talking about?" "Approximately 200 individuals with potential access to the information necessary to plan this operation. 200 suspects, any of whom might have spent months planning to deploy chemical weapons against civilian targets." Walsh assigned Kane and me to work with FBI agent Sierra Martinez on local intelligence gathering. Our job was to identify anyone in the area who had military explosive experience, access to heavy construction equipment, or knowledge of the Pemberton facility. "Start with obvious connections," Martinez instructed. "Former military EOD personnel, construction company owners, anyone who worked at the facility during active operations. We're looking for patterns of behavior, recent changes in routine, unexplained wealth, or unusual equipment acquisitions." We began with the Riverside County Veterans Administration Office. If someone with military explosives training was living in the area, they might be receiving VA benefits or participating in veterans programs. The VA administrator, Ms. Sarah Chen, was cooperative but cautious. "Officers, I can provide general information about veterans in the area, but specific records require federal subpoena." "Ms. Chen," Kane explained, "we're specifically interested in anyone with explosive ordnance disposal training, combat engineering background, or demolitions expertise." Chen consulted her computer system. "In Riverside County, we have approximately 40 veterans with EOD or combat engineering experience. Most are older gentlemen who served in Vietnam or the Gulf War. But there are several younger veterans with Iraq and Afghanistan experience." Martinez asked, "Have any of these individuals been involved in recent VA counseling or financial assistance programs?" "That's confidential information, but—" Chen paused. "There is one veteran who has been requesting unusual documentation recently. Austin Reynolds, former Army EOD specialist. He's been asking for copies of his service records, specifically records related to specialized training and security clearances." Austin Reynolds. Kane and I made note of the name while Martinez requested full background information. Our next stop was Morrison Construction, the largest heavy equipment contractor in the county. If someone needed excavators and drilling equipment for the Pemberton operation, they might have acquired it through legitimate rental or purchase. Company owner Bill Morrison was less cooperative than the VA administrator. "Officers, I rent equipment to dozens of contractors every month. I can't keep track of every job site or every piece of machinery." "Mr. Morrison," I explained, "we're investigating theft of construction equipment that was used in a federal crime. We need to know if anyone has rented excavation equipment from you over the past 6 months. particularly for night work or unusual projects. Morrison consulted his rental logs. Let me check. Yeah, we've had several major equipment rentals recently. 3 excavators, 2 dump trucks, and a specialized drilling rig, all rented to the same contractor. Kane looked up from her notes. What contractor? Reynolds Demolition Services, Austin Reynolds, owner. Paid in cash, 6-month rental agreement said he was working on a federal cleanup project. Austin Reynolds. The same name from the VA office. Martinez was immediately on her radio, calling for a full background check and current address information. Within 10 minutes, we had a complete profile. Austin Reynolds, age 34, Army veteran with 12 years of service including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. Specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal, demolitions and hazardous materials handling. Honorably discharged in 2016, relocated to Riverside County, established a demolitions contracting business, and according to county records, his business address was a rural property located less than 3 miles from the Pemberton facility. Deputies, Martinez said, we're going to need to approach this carefully. If Reynolds is our suspect, he's got military training, access to explosives, and potentially 400 pounds of chemical weapons. This isn't a routine arrest. Walsh coordinated with the FBI tactical team while Kane and I provided intelligence on the approach routes to Reynolds' property. The plan was to conduct simultaneous surveillance of his residence and business location while building a case for search warrants. But at 2:15 p.m. our investigation took an unexpected turn. All units, came the urgent radio transmission from FBI Surveillance Team Alpha. Subject Austin Reynolds has been located. He's deceased. Repeat, subject is deceased. Kane and I were dispatched to assist with the scene investigation. We found Reynolds' body in his workshop, a converted barn behind his residence that contained enough demolitions equipment to supply a major construction project. Agent Martinez briefed us as the medical examiner processed the scene. Reynolds appears to have died from exposure to chemical agents. Preliminary assessment suggests he was working with hazardous materials and suffered accidental poisoning. When did this happen? Kane asked. Based on the condition of the body, approximately 48 hours ago, which means he died around the time of the Pemberton facility explosions. I examined the workshop while the federal agents documented evidence. It contained professional demolition equipment, detailed maps of the Pemberton facility, and what appeared to be laboratory equipment for processing chemical agents. Agent Martinez, I called out. You need to see this. She approached my position near a workbench that was covered with chemical processing equipment. Glass containers, distillation apparatus, and measurement devices that suggested Reynolds had been refining or concentrating the materials stolen from Pemberton. This isn't just storage equipment, Martinez observed. He was actively processing the chemical agents, possibly trying to increase their potency or change their delivery mechanism. But there was something else that made the situation even more disturbing. The workshop contained multiple sets of equipment, enough for several people to work simultaneously on different projects. Martinez looked at the workstation setup. Reynolds wasn't working alone. She surveyed the workshop more carefully. You're right, multiple workstations, different specializations, coordinated equipment layout. This was a team operation. Kane was examining a wall-mounted map of the region with various locations marked in red. And they weren't planning to use the materials locally. Look at these target areas. The map showed major cities throughout 3 states, with detailed notations about population density, wind patterns, and infrastructure vulnerabilities. This wasn't a local attack plan. It was a coordinated campaign designed to affect millions of people. Agent Martinez, I said, If Reynolds was part of a team and he's dead, where are the other team members? And do they still have access to the chemical weapons? Martinez was already coordinating with the federal response teams. That's what we need to find out, and we need to find out fast. The search of Reynolds' property continued for 6 hours. Federal agents discovered extensive documentation of the Pemberton facility operation, including detailed floor plans, security assessments, and transportation logistics. But they also found something more troubling: communication logs showing coordination with multiple other individuals, financial records indicating payments to various contractors and suppliers, and shipping receipts for materials and equipment that suggested the operation was much larger than initially suspected. Deputies. Walsh briefed us as the search concluded. Reynolds was the demolition specialist for a larger organization. Based on the evidence we've recovered, there are at least 6 other individuals involved in this operation, and they have access to resources that suggest significant funding and planning. Kane asked, "What kind of resources?" "Professional laboratory equipment, specialized transportation vehicles, communication systems, and what appears to be safe houses or operational bases in multiple states. And they still have the chemical weapons?" Walsh nodded. Reynolds was processing the materials, but the finished products were being transported elsewhere. We estimate that the team successfully removed and processed approximately 300 pounds of chemical agents before Reynolds' accidental death. 300 pounds of weaponized chemical agents in the hands of a coordinated team with the resources and planning capability to deploy them against major population centers. At 8:30 p.m., the FBI received intelligence that transformed the investigation from urgent to critical. "All units," Walsh announced over the tactical radio. "We've intercepted communications indicating that the remaining team members are accelerating their timeline in response to Reynolds' death. Current intelligence suggests they plan to deploy chemical weapons within the next 48 hours. Kane and I were assigned to join the FBI's Area Denial Task Force, a specialized unit responsible for identifying and protecting potential targets in our region. Our job was to assess the vulnerability of major infrastructure, population centers, and symbolic targets that might be attractive to a domestic terrorism cell. But as we began that assessment, we realized that the stolen chemical weapons could be deployed in dozens of different ways, against hundreds of different targets. Shopping centers, schools, government buildings, transportation hubs, water treatment facilities. Any location where large numbers of people gathered or critical infrastructure could be disrupted. "Agent Walsh," I asked during our evening briefing, "do we have any intelligence on what specific targets they might be considering?" Based on the materials we found at Reynolds' property, they appear to be focusing on economic targets rather than symbolic ones. Major commercial areas, industrial facilities, transportation corridors, targets that would cause maximum economic disruption rather than maximum casualties. Why would they prioritize economic targets over casualties? Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Because their goal isn't just to kill people, Deputy Torres. Their goal is to demonstrate that the government can't protect critical infrastructure from chemical weapons attack. They want to prove that domestic terrorism using military-grade weapons is not only possible, but inevitable. Economic terrorism using stolen military chemical weapons. An attack designed to prove that federal security measures were inadequate and that domestic terrorists could acquire and deploy weapons of mass destruction." As I filed my daily report that evening, I realized that we were dealing with something far more sophisticated and dangerous than a typical criminal investigation. This was a planned assault on the economic and psychological security of the entire region, conducted by people with military training, inside knowledge, and access to some of the most dangerous weapons ever developed. and we had less than 48 hours to stop them. At 6:15 a.m. Friday morning, the FBI intercepted a communication that changed everything. Agent Walsh called an emergency briefing as federal agents and local law enforcement converged on the command post. "People, we've got actionable intelligence," Walsh announced. NSA intercepted encrypted communications between suspected cell members. They're planning to execute their operation this weekend during the Riverside County Agricultural Festival. The Agricultural Festival. 40,000 people gathered in downtown Riverside for 3 days of farming exhibits, food vendors, and family entertainment. If someone wanted to maximize exposure to chemical weapons, it would be the perfect target. Kane raised her hand. "Agent Walsh, what's our threat assessment for chemical weapons deployment at an outdoor event?" "Worst-case scenario. If they deploy aerosolized chemical agents using vehicle-mounted dispensers or aircraft, we could see casualties in the thousands. The chemical agents stolen from Pemberton were designed for battlefield use. They're lethal, even in small concentrations." I studied the festival layout maps that Walsh had distributed. "Agent Walsh, the festival covers 12 city blocks, with multiple entry points and thousands of vehicles. How do we protect an area that large?" "We don't," Walsh replied. "We find the attackers before they reach the target." The FBI had identified 3 potential cell members based on communication intercepts and financial analysis of Reynolds' operation. Nathan Carter, former Army chemical weapons specialist. Ethan Morrison, demolitions expert with private military contractor background. And Cody Stevens, logistics coordinator with access to commercial transportation vehicles. All 3 individuals have disappeared from their known addresses, Agent Martinez explained. But we've got surveillance on their known associates, financial accounts, and vehicle registrations. If they surface anywhere in the region, we'll know about it. Kane and I were assigned to work with FBI agent Haley Rodriguez on mobile surveillance. Our job was to monitor potential staging areas where the cell might prepare their chemical weapons for deployment, industrial locations, storage facilities, or isolated areas where they could work without observation. The communication intercepts mentioned a processing facility. Rodriguez briefed us as we prepared for patrol. Somewhere, they can finalize preparation of the chemical agents and load them into delivery systems. We're looking for industrial buildings, warehouses, or rural properties with recent activity. Our first target was the abandoned Riverside Manufacturing Complex, a 200-acre industrial site that had been empty for 5 years. Perfect location for preparing chemical weapons. Isolated, multiple building access, and rail connections for transportation. We established observation from the tree line south of the complex. Through binoculars, the facility appeared completely abandoned. No vehicles, no lights, no signs of recent activity. But Kane noticed something that didn't fit. "Mason, look at Building 7, the one with the blue roof." I focused on the building she indicated. Most of the industrial complex showed obvious signs of abandonment. Broken windows, vegetation growth, weathered surfaces. But Building 7 looked different. The doors were intact. The area around the building had been recently cleared, and there were fresh tire tracks in the gravel. "Rodriguez, we've got possible activity at Building 7. Recent vehicle access, maintained appearance." Rodriguez was immediately on her radio, requesting backup and hazmat support. "If this is their processing facility, we need to approach with full protective equipment. Those chemical agents are lethal on contact." The FBI tactical team arrived 30 minutes later with specialized equipment for chemical weapons operations. Full environmental suits, air filtration systems, detection devices, and neutralization chemicals in case of accidental exposure. Agent Walsh coordinated the approach. Team Alpha will breach from the north entrance. Team Bravo will secure the perimeter. Local law enforcement maintains outer containment. If anyone tries to flee, detain them for hazmat processing before transport. Kane and I positioned ourselves at the main access road with instructions to stop any vehicles attempting to leave the area. But as the tactical teams approached Building 7, we received an urgent radio transmission. Command, this is Team Alpha. Building 7 is empty, but we've got evidence of recent chemical processing operations. Industrial fans, ventilation equipment, chemical residue on work surfaces. Somebody was definitely working in here. Walsh responded immediately. Team Alpha, timeline assessment. Command, based on the residue patterns and equipment configuration, they finished operations here within the last 12 hours, maybe less. 12 hours. The cell had completed their chemical weapons preparation and moved to the deployment phase. Rodriguez was coordinating with NSA intelligence officers. All units, we've got new communication intercepts. Cell members are discussing Saturday morning delivery and festival coverage. That gives us approximately 30 hours to locate them. The search expanded to include every industrial facility, storage warehouse, and rural property within 50 miles of Riverside. Federal agents, state police, and local law enforcement units conducted simultaneous sweeps of potential locations. But at 2:45 p.m., we got a break that came from an unexpected source. Unit 47. Dispatch called over the radio. Respond to a suspicious vehicle report at the Millbrook Storage Center, Highway 15 and County Road 23. Manager reports unusual activity at Unit 47. Kane and I responded to what appeared to be a routine call. The storage facility manager, elderly man named Frank Peterson, met us at the main gate. Officers, I rent Unit 47 to a guy named Stevens. Paid 6 months in advance, cash, said he was storing construction equipment. But this morning, I saw him loading what looked like spray equipment into a commercial van. Cody Stevens, one of the 3 suspected cell members. Mr. Peterson, Kane asked, is Stevens still on the property? No, he left about an hour ago, but his storage unit is still rented through the end of the month. I radioed for FBI backup while Kane requested Peterson's master key for the storage unit. If Stevens was using the facility to store chemical weapons or deployment equipment, we needed to secure it immediately. Agent Rodriguez arrived with the hazmat team as we prepared to open Storage Unit 47. Deputies, let my team handle the entry. If there are chemical residues in there, you don't want to be exposed without protective equipment. The FBI team opened the storage unit wearing full environmental suits. What they found confirmed our worst fears. Command, this is Hazmat Team. Unit 47 contains chemical processing equipment, spray devices designed for vehicle mounting, and residual traces of military chemical agents. This was definitely their deployment preparation site. Rodriguez emerged from the storage unit with photographic evidence. Vehicle-mounted spray equipment designed to disperse chemical agents from moving vehicles. Computer equipment with detailed maps of the festival area and wind pattern analysis. And most disturbing, protective equipment and antidotes that suggested the attackers planned to survive their own chemical weapons deployment. Rodriguez, I said, if they're planning to survive the attack, that means they're not planning a suicide operation. They intend to escape and potentially conduct additional attacks. She was already coordinating with federal response teams. All units were dealing with a coordinated chemical weapons attack planned for tomorrow morning. Suspects are mobile, armed with vehicle-mounted dispersal systems, and have approximately 300 pounds of weaponized chemical agents. Kane asked the question we were all thinking. Rodriguez, What's our protocol for protecting 40,000 people from a chemical weapons attack? We find the attackers before they reach the festival, or we cancel the festival and evacuate the downtown area. But as federal agencies debated evacuation options, Mayor Patricia Williams made a decision that complicated our response strategy. The festival would continue as scheduled, with enhanced security and chemical detection equipment. We can't let terrorists dictate our community events, Williams announced at the evening press briefing. But we're taking every precaution to ensure public safety. Walsh was furious with the decision. Deputies, we now have to protect a public event with 40,000 attendees from attackers using military chemical weapons. This is the worst-case scenario for law enforcement. The festival security plan required coordination between FBI, state police, local law enforcement, hazmat teams, and medical response units. Chemical detection devices throughout the festival area, rapid response teams positioned at strategic locations, and evacuation protocols for immediate implementation if chemical agents were detected. Kane and I were assigned to mobile patrol with specialized detection equipment. Our job was to monitor vehicle traffic approaching the festival area and identify any vehicles equipped with spray systems or showing elevated chemical readings. At 8:30 p.m. Friday evening, we got the intelligence report that confirmed our timeline. All units, Walsh announced. Communication intercepts indicate the attack is scheduled for 10 a.m. Saturday morning. Opening ceremony of the agricultural festival. Maximum crowd density, optimal wind conditions for chemical dispersal. 10 a.m. Saturday. Less than 14 hours to locate and stop 3 attackers with enough chemical weapons to kill thousands of people. As I prepared for what would likely be the longest night of my law enforcement career, I realized that we were facing a situation that went beyond normal police work. This was domestic terrorism using weapons of mass destruction, conducted by trained military personnel who understood both the capabilities of their weapons and the limitations of our response. The festival would begin in 12 hours. 40,000 people would gather in downtown Riverside, unaware that former military personnel with stolen chemical weapons were planning to attack them using vehicle-mounted spray systems. And we still had no idea where the attackers were hiding or what route they planned to use to reach their target. But at 11:47 p.m., Kane spotted something that broke the case wide open. "Mason," she called from her position monitoring Highway 15 traffic. "White commercial van. Northbound, single occupant, driving below speed limit." I focused my binoculars on the vehicle. It appeared to be a standard commercial van, but there was something unusual about the equipment mounted on its roof. "Kane, is that an air conditioning unit or some kind of spray system?" She was already running the license plate through our mobile computer. Plate comes back to Stevens Logistics, registered to Cody Stevens. And Mason, our chemical detection equipment is showing elevated readings. Cody Stevens, driving a van equipped with spray systems and carrying chemical weapons, 12 hours before the scheduled attack on the agricultural festival. We had found our criminals. I called it in immediately using the encrypted federal channel. "FBI command, this is Unit 47. We have visual contact with suspect Cody Stevens, white commercial van with possible chemical dispersal equipment. Vehicle is northbound on Highway 15, approaching the festival area." Agent Walsh's response was immediate. "Unit 47, do not attempt to stop the vehicle. Maintain surveillance distance. If the chemical agents are breached during a traffic stop, you could contaminate a square mile of territory." Kane was tracking Stevens's van through binoculars as we followed at a distance. "Mason, he's not heading toward downtown. He's taking the County Road 31 exit, heading east toward the industrial district." That didn't match the attack profile. If Stevens was planning to deploy chemical weapons at the agricultural festival, he should be moving toward downtown Riverside, not away from it. FBI command, suspect vehicle is diverging from expected route, moving away from festival area toward industrial sector. Walsh came back on the radio with tension in his voice. Unit 47. Communications intelligence indicates the cell is using multiple vehicles for coordinated attack. Stevens may be heading to a staging area to rendezvous with other team members. Multiple vehicles. A coordinated chemical weapons attack using several deployment systems simultaneously. The scope of the potential disaster was expanding by the minute. Stevens's van turned into the parking lot of the Riverside Chemical Processing Plant, a legitimate industrial facility that handled agricultural chemicals and fertilizers. If he was meeting other cell members there, they'd have access to additional chemical processing equipment and raw materials. FBI command, suspect has stopped at Riverside Chemical Plant, 1247 Industrial Parkway. Appears to be meeting with additional personnel. Unit 47, maintain observation. Tactical teams are en route. Do not engage until backup arrives. Through our surveillance equipment, Kane and I watched as Stevens was joined by two other individuals. Both emerged from a second vehicle, a large truck with equipment mounted in the cargo bed that looked suspiciously similar to agricultural spray systems. Mason, that truck is equipped for large-scale chemical dispersal. If they fill that system with military chemical agents... She didn't finish the sentence. We both understood the implications. A truck-mounted agricultural spray system could disperse chemical weapons across several square miles, potentially affecting the entire city of Riverside. At 12:23 a.m. Saturday morning, the FBI tactical teams arrived. Agent Walsh coordinated with hazmat specialists and chemical weapons experts to plan an approach that would neutralize the threat without triggering accidental release of chemical agents. Deputies, Walsh briefed us. We've identified the other two suspects, Nathan Carter and Ethan Morrison, both at the chemical plant with Stevens. Intelligence suggests they're loading the truck-mounted spray system with weaponized chemical agents. Kane asked, "What's our tactical approach? If we assault the facility while they're handling chemical weapons, could we trigger an accidental release?" "That's the risk we're facing," Walsh admitted. "But if we allow them to complete their preparations and deploy those weapons against the festival, we're looking at thousands of casualties." The chemical plant presented unique tactical challenges. Multiple buildings, industrial equipment that could provide cover for the suspects, and legitimate chemical storage that could complicate the hazmat response if it was damaged during an assault. "Agent Walsh," I suggested, "what if we don't assault the facility? What if we wait for them to leave and intercept them before they reach the festival?" Walsh consulted with his tactical team leaders. "That's option 2. But if we lose them during transport, or if they detect our surveillance and decide to deploy the weapons immediately at an alternate target." It was a calculated risk. Assault the chemical plant and possibly trigger accidental release of chemical weapons, or allow the suspects to leave and risk losing them during transport to their attack target. At 1:15 a.m., the decision was made for us. "All units," came the urgent radio transmission. "Suspects are preparing to depart to the chemical plant. 2 vehicles, both equipped with chemical dispersal systems. Looks like they're beginning movement toward the festival area." The convoy consisted of Stevens's van and the larger truck with agricultural spray equipment. Both vehicles showed positive readings on chemical detection equipment, confirming that they were carrying weaponized chemical agents. Kane and I joined the FBI surveillance team as they tracked the convoy through rural roads toward downtown Riverside. Multiple law enforcement units maintained loose formation around the vehicles, while hazmat teams prepared for emergency response. But at 1:47 a.m., the situation took an unexpected turn. All units, suspect convoy is splitting up. Van is continuing toward downtown. Truck is diverting toward the industrial district near the river. 2 targets. They weren't planning a single coordinated attack on the festival. They were planning simultaneous attacks on multiple locations. Walsh made a command decision. Team Alpha will pursue the van toward downtown. Team Bravo will follow the truck toward the river district. All units maintain chemical detection equipment and be prepared for emergency decontamination. Kane and I were assigned to Team Alpha, tracking Stevens's van toward the festival area. Through our chemical detection equipment, we could monitor the weapons signature as Stevens moved through residential neighborhoods toward downtown Riverside. At 2:31 a.m., Stevens stopped his van in the parking lot of Riverside Elementary School, located 6 blocks from the festival area. Through surveillance equipment, we watched as he began making final preparations to the vehicle-mounted spray system. FBI command. Suspect Stevens is preparing dispersal equipment at Riverside Elementary. Chemical readings are increasing. Walsh's voice carried barely controlled urgency. Team Alpha. Stevens may be planning to test the dispersal system before the main attack. If he releases chemical agents at that school... The elementary school was surrounded by residential neighborhoods. Even a test deployment of military chemical weapons could contaminate dozens of homes and potentially kill anyone exposed to the agents. Kane was monitoring wind patterns through our tactical weather equipment. Mason. Current wind conditions would carry chemical dispersal southeast toward the residential area on Maple Street. Approximately 200 homes in the potential contamination zone. I made a tactical decision that went against FBI protocol. Kane, we can't wait for the tactical team. If Stevens deploys those weapons, we'll have mass civilian casualties before backup arrives. Kane nodded. We'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. Both of us understood that we were about to engage a suspect armed with weapons of mass destruction, using only standard police equipment and training. FBI Command, Units 47 and 19 are moving to intercept Stevens before he can deploy chemical weapons. Civilian lives are in immediate danger. Walsh tried to countermand our approach. Units 47 and 19 stand down. Wait for tactical team with chemical protective equipment. But by then, Kane and I were already moving. We approached Stevens's van from opposite directions, using the school building for cover. Our plan was simple: disable the vehicle's spray system before Stevens could activate it, then retreat to safe distance until the hazmat team arrived. Stevens was focused on his equipment preparations and didn't notice our approach until Kane was within 20 yards of his position. When he spotted her, his reaction confirmed our worst fears about his training and commitment. Instead of surrendering or attempting to flee, Stevens immediately began activating the chemical dispersal system. Kane fired twice, center mass, standard police defensive shooting protocol. Stevens went down, but the damage was done. The spray system had been activated, and chemical agents were beginning to discharge from the vehicle-mounted equipment. I radioed immediately for hazmat emergency response while Kane and I retreated to what we hoped was safe distance. But as we withdrew, the wind shifted, and we could smell the distinctive metallic odor that indicated chemical agents were becoming airborne. All units. Chemical weapons have been deployed at Riverside Elementary School, initiating immediate evacuation of surrounding residential area. The next 4 hours were controlled chaos. Hazmat teams worked to contain the chemical contamination, while emergency services evacuated a 6-block radius around the school. Kane and I were processed through decontamination procedures and held for medical observation due to potential chemical exposure. But while we were dealing with Stevens's van, Team Bravo was tracking the truck with Morrison and Carter toward the River District, and what they found there was even more disturbing than the elementary school attack. Agent Rodriguez briefed us during our decontamination processing. Morrison and Carter weren't planning to attack civilian targets. They were targeting the municipal water treatment plant. If they'd succeeded in contaminating the water supply with military chemical agents, the entire city would have been affected. Were they stopped? Rodriguez nodded. Tactical team intercepted them as they were preparing to breach the water treatment facility perimeter. Both suspects were killed during the engagement, but not before they'd released a significant quantity of chemical agents into Mill Creek. Mill Creek feeds into the Riverside municipal water supply. Even with immediate containment efforts, the chemical contamination had entered the water system that served 150,000 residents. By dawn Saturday morning, the agricultural festival had been canceled, and the city of Riverside was under emergency evacuation orders. Chemical contamination from the elementary school attack and the water system breach had created two separate but overlapping hazard zones. Kane and I spent the next 6 hours in medical observation while doctors monitored us for symptoms of chemical weapons exposure. The medical team couldn't be sure what specific agents we'd been exposed to, since the military chemicals stolen from Pemberton had been processed and possibly combined with other substances. Deputies, Dr. Emily Morgan explained during our medical evaluation, the chemical agents used in this attack were designed for battlefield deployment against military personnel. We don't have complete data on their effects on civilian populations, especially after prolonged exposure. Doctor, what are our long-term health prospects? That depends on the concentration and duration of your exposure. We're treating you with standard chemical weapons antidotes, but some effects may not manifest for weeks or months. Weeks or months. Kane and I might be dealing with health consequences from our brief exposure to military chemical weapons for the rest of our lives. But as serious as our personal health concerns were, they paled in comparison to the broader implications of what had happened in Riverside. Agent Walsh debriefed us on Sunday morning as the scope of the contamination became clear. Deputies, the attack was partially successful despite our intervention. The elementary school site remains contaminated and uninhabitable. The water treatment plant will require months of decontamination before it can resume operations. And approximately 50,000 residents have been temporarily evacuated due to potential chemical exposure. Agent Walsh, do we know if there were additional cell members who escaped? Walsh consulted his notes. That's still under investigation. Reynolds, Stevens, Carter, and Morrison are all deceased, but the sophistication of their operation suggests they had significant support, financial backing, technical assistance, possibly additional personnel we haven't identified. Kane asked, "What's the long-term prognosis for the city?" The elementary school and surrounding residential area will require extensive decontamination that could take years. The water treatment plant can be cleaned, but the municipal water supply will need to be replaced with temporary systems until the facility is fully operational. Economic impact is estimated at several $billion. Several $billion in damage, 50,000 people displaced, and an unknown number of casualties from a domestic terrorism attack using stolen military chemical weapons. But there was one more aspect of the attack that troubled me more than the immediate damage. Agent Walsh, the communication intercepts you mentioned, did they indicate whether this cell was planning additional attacks beyond Riverside? Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Deputy Torres, that's classified information, but yes, intelligence suggests that the Riverside attack was intended as a demonstration, a proof of concept for using stolen military chemical weapons against civilian targets. A demonstration for who? Other domestic terrorism groups. The goal wasn't just to attack Riverside. The goal was to prove that military-grade chemical weapons could be acquired, processed, and deployed against American cities. A demonstration attack, the theft of chemical weapons from Pemberton, the months of preparation, the coordinated assault on multiple targets, all of it designed to show other terrorist groups that attacks using weapons of mass destruction were not only possible, but relatively easy to execute. 3 weeks later, Kane and I returned to duty with medical monitoring requirements and ongoing health assessments. We were assigned to different patrol areas. The Pemberton facility and most of eastern Riverside County remained under federal control as part of the ongoing investigation and decontamination efforts. But the psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the contaminated areas. Residents throughout the region lived with the knowledge that domestic terrorists had successfully acquired and deployed military chemical weapons, and that similar attacks might be planned for other communities. The official after-action report classified the Riverside incident as a successful interdiction of domestic terrorism with limited civilian impact. But for those of us who lived through it, who watched an entire city evacuated due to chemical weapons contamination, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a warning, a demonstration that the weapons of mass destruction we'd spent decades worrying about, nuclear bombs, biological agents, military chemical weapons, weren't just theoretical threats controlled by foreign governments. They were real, available, and in the hands of people who understood exactly how to use them against American communities. The Pemberton Army ammunition plant remains under federal security control. Additional facilities throughout the region have been inspected and secured, but questions remain about how many other decommissioned military sites contain materials that could be acquired by domestic terrorist groups. Kane developed respiratory complications 6 months after our chemical exposure and took early medical retirement. She moved to another state where the air quality might be better for her long-term health. I continued patrol duties in Riverside County, but in a different sector, away from the contaminated zones that serve as permanent reminders of the night we learned that some threats can't be stopped, only managed. You learn to trust your instincts after 15 years in law enforcement, but sometimes your instincts tell you things you don't want to believe. This story began on a Tuesday night in March 2020, during what should have been a routine patrol shift in Millbrook County, Ohio. I'm Sergeant Tyler Camden, and my patrol sector includes the Blackwood Industrial Corridor, a stretch of abandoned factories and chemical plants that used to be the economic heart of our county before everything shut down in the late 90s. Most of it's been empty for decades, but one facility still generates regular police calls: the Meridian Chemical Processing Plant. In 1998, a storage tank failure at Meridian released approximately 50,000 gallons of industrial solvents into the groundwater. The EPA declared the entire facility and surrounding 3-mile radius a contamination zone. Everyone living within the perimeter was relocated. Businesses were shuttered, and the area was sealed off with federal barriers. 22 years later, it's still contaminated, still empty. Still my responsibility to patrol twice per shift. The call came in at 11:34 p.m. Dispatch's voice carried that tone that meant something was off, even if she couldn't quite identify what. Unit 15, respond to the Meridian Exclusion Zone. Possible trespassing. Anonymous caller reports seeing lights and hearing voices inside the contamination perimeter. I keyed up immediately. Unit 15 copies, en route to Meridian Zone. ETA 6 minutes. Unit 15, be advised. EPA protocols require hazmat notification for any entry into the exclusion zone. Also requesting backup unit for federal property violation. Federal property violation. The Meridian site wasn't just abandoned property, it was federally controlled contaminated land. Anyone inside that perimeter without proper protective equipment could be exposed to chemical concentrations that cause permanent neurological damage or death. Unit 22 responded as backup. Officer Madison Pierce, relatively new to the department but solid instincts. More importantly, she'd worked industrial safety before joining law enforcement, so she understood the health risks we were dealing with. I reached the main access point to the exclusion zone at 11:40 p.m. The federal barriers were still in place, 12-foot chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, warning signs every 50 yards in English and Spanish. Danger. Contaminated area. No entry by order of EPA. But as I examined the main gate, it was clear that someone had been inside recently. The locks on the gate were intact, but there was a section of fence about 200 yards to the north where the chain link had been carefully cut and reattached. Professional work, not random vandalism. Madison arrived as I was documenting the breach point. She examined the cut fence with her flashlight while I called in the EPA notification. "Tyler," she said. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Clean cuts, minimal disturbance to the surrounding fence, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Madison, take a look inside the zone. Do you see what I'm seeing?" She followed my gaze through the fence line toward the interior of the exclusion zone. In the distance, maybe half a mile inside the perimeter, there were lights moving through the abandoned industrial complex. Not flashlights. Steady lights, like someone had restored electricity to buildings that had been without power for over 20 years. "Tyler, that's not possible. The electrical grid to this entire area was shut down and physically disconnected when the zone was established." I was already on the radio with EPA emergency response. "This is Millbrook County Sheriff's Unit 15. We have confirmation of unauthorized personnel inside the Meridian exclusion zone with evidence of electrical activity in abandoned structures." The EPA duty officer responded within minutes. "Unit 15, this is Agent Morgan Taylor, EPA Region 5 Emergency Response. We're dispatching a hazmat team to your location. Under no circumstances should local law enforcement enter the exclusion zone without full protective equipment. Agent Taylor, we have visual confirmation of lights and possible structures being occupied inside the zone. How long until your team arrives?" Unit 15, ETA 90 minutes for full hazmat response. The contamination in that zone includes benzene, toluene, xylene, and various chlorinated solvents. Exposure can cause immediate unconsciousness and permanent neurological damage. 90 minutes. Madison and I established a perimeter outside the fence line and continued observation of the activity inside the exclusion zone. But as we watched, it became clear that whatever was happening in there was much more extensive than simple trespassing. The lights we'd initially observed weren't just in one building. They were scattered throughout the industrial complex, at least 6 separate structures showing signs of electrical activity. And there was something else. We could hear the sound of machinery operating inside the zone. "Madison, are you hearing that?" She was already recording audio with her body camera. "Sounds like generators, maybe industrial equipment. But Tyler, if people are operating machinery inside a contaminated zone without protective equipment..." She didn't finish the sentence. We both understood the implication. Extended exposure to the chemical contamination at Meridian could cause permanent brain damage, respiratory failure, or death. At 12:47 a.m., we observed vehicle headlights moving inside the exclusion zone. Not just one vehicle, but a convoy of at least 3 vehicles traveling along the old access road toward the main chemical processing building. I radioed the EPA team immediately. "Agent Taylor, we're observing a convoy of vehicles inside the exclusion zone. Multiple personnel appear to be conducting organized operations inside the contaminated area. Unit 15, maintain observation but do not approach the fence line. were reading elevated chemical concentrations in the air around the perimeter. Even brief exposure could be dangerous. Elevated concentrations. The chemical contamination wasn't just contained inside the zone. It was migrating beyond the perimeter fencing. Madison was monitoring air quality with portable detection equipment we carried for hazmat calls. Tyler, I'm getting readings for volatile organic compounds. Low levels, but definitely above normal background. How low? Low enough that we're probably safe at this distance, but high enough that anyone inside the zone without protective equipment would be experiencing symptoms within hours. At 1:23 a.m., Agent Taylor arrived with a full EPA hazmat response team. 8 personnel in Level A protective suits, specialized vehicles, and enough detection equipment to monitor chemical contamination across several square miles. Sergeant Camden, Agent Taylor briefed us while his team prepared entry equipment. What we're dealing with here is potentially catastrophic. The Meridian site contains some of the most dangerous industrial chemicals ever manufactured. If unauthorized personnel are accessing that contamination, Agent Taylor, what kind of chemicals are we talking about? Industrial solvents, heavy metals, carcinogenic compounds, and what our records euphemistically call process byproducts that were never fully identified. Some of the materials in that facility were so dangerous that we couldn't even safely remove them during the initial cleanup. Madison spoke up. Agent Taylor, if the contamination is that dangerous, why wasn't the entire facility demolished? Because disturbing the contaminated soil and structures would have released chemical vapors that could have affected the entire county. The safest approach was containment. Seal everything in place and wait for natural degradation over the next 50 to 75 years. 50 to 75 years. The Meridian site was supposed to remain sealed and uninhabited until sometime after 2070. But someone had broken into the zone and was conducting operations inside buildings that contained industrial chemicals too dangerous to be safely removed. Agent Taylor, what's our protocol for apprehending subjects inside a contaminated zone? Taylor consulted with his hazmat team leaders. Standard procedure would be to wait for the subjects to exit the zone and apprehend them at the perimeter. But if they've been inside for any significant period, they'll need immediate medical treatment for chemical exposure. And if they don't exit voluntarily, then we have a problem, Sergeant. We can't conduct law enforcement operations inside a zone that's contaminated with chemicals that could kill responding officers. At 2:15 a.m., the EPA team completed their initial assessment of the breach site and chemical monitoring around the perimeter. Agent Taylor's briefing confirmed our worst fears. Sergeant Camden, the contamination levels inside the zone are actually higher than when it was first sealed in 1998. Instead of natural degradation, we're seeing evidence that the chemicals have become more concentrated and potentially more dangerous over time. How is that possible? Chemical interaction, groundwater movement, structural deterioration that's allowed different contaminants to mix. The point is, anyone operating inside that zone without proper protection is being exposed to concentrations that could be lethal within hours. Madison was studying the EPA monitoring data. Agent Taylor, if the contamination has become more dangerous over time, why haven't you increased security around the perimeter? Taylor was quiet for a moment. Budget constraints, Sergeant Pierce. EPA monitoring of contained sites like Meridian has been reduced significantly over the past decade. We conduct annual inspections, but we don't maintain full-time security. Annual inspections. The most dangerous industrial contamination site in the county was checked once per year. At 2:45 a.m., the situation escalated. All units, came the urgent radio transmission from Madison. We've got personnel exiting the exclusion zone. 3 individuals, no protective equipment, approaching the fence line. Agent Taylor's hazmat team was immediately on alert. All personnel, subjects exiting the contamination zone will require immediate decontamination and medical assessment. Do not allow direct contact until they've been processed. Through binoculars, I watched 3 figures approach the fence line from inside the exclusion zone. They moved slowly, unsteadily, like people who were disoriented or experiencing balance problems. Chemical exposure symptoms. Agent Taylor, the subjects appear to be exhibiting signs of neurological impairment. Unsteady gait, difficulty maintaining direction. Sergeant Camden, that's consistent with exposure to the solvents and heavy metals in the meridian contamination. We need to get them into decontamination immediately. But as the 3 figures reached the fence line, something happened that transformed our response from urgent to critical. They collapsed. All 3 of them within seconds of reaching the perimeter fence. Madison was immediately on the radio calling for emergency medical response. Dispatch, we need multiple ambulances at the Meridian exclusion zone. 3 subjects down, possible chemical poisoning, requiring hazmat medical protocols. Agent Taylor's team moved quickly to establish decontamination procedures for the collapsed subjects. But as they worked, we realized that we were dealing with a situation that went far beyond simple trespassing. Sergeant Camden, Agent Taylor called out as his team worked. These subjects have been exposed to massive concentrations of industrial chemicals. Based on their symptoms, they've been inside the zone for hours, possibly days. Agent Taylor, what does that tell us about their operations in there? It tells us that whatever they were doing was important enough to risk their lives. And if they were willing to accept potentially lethal chemical exposure to complete their mission, we need to find out what that mission was. At 3:30 a.m., as EMS transported the 3 subjects to specialized medical facilities equipped to handle chemical poisoning, Agent Taylor made a decision that would change the scope of our investigation. Sergeant Camden, I'm authorizing immediate entry into the exclusion zone. Full hazmat protocols, but we need to determine what these people were doing inside the contaminated area. As the EPA team prepared to enter the Meridian site, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to discover something that had been hidden in that contaminated zone for over 20 years. Something that someone was willing to die to access. Entry into the Meridian exclusion zone required full level A hazmat protection. Sealed suits with independent air supply, chemical-resistant boots, and communication systems designed to function in contaminated environments. Agent Taylor briefed Madison and me on the protocols as his team prepared the entry equipment. Deputies, inside the zone, standard police procedures don't apply. We move as a unit, we don't separate, and if anyone's suit is breached or equipment fails, immediate extraction takes priority over investigation. Madison asked, Agent Taylor, what's our objective inside the zone? Determine what unauthorized personnel were doing in the contaminated area, assess any additional environmental threats they may have created, and document evidence for federal prosecution. I suited up with assistance from the EPA technicians. The Level A protection was bulky, restrictive, and made normal police work nearly impossible. My sidearm was accessible but difficult to draw. My radio worked, but with significant delay, and my vision was limited to what I could see through the faceplate of the hazmat suit. At 4:15 a.m., our team of 6 entered the Meridian exclusion zone through the cut fence line. Agent Taylor led, followed by 2 EPA specialists, then Madison and me, with another EPA technician bringing up the rear. The air inside the zone carried a chemical odor that was noticeable even through the suit's air filtration system. Sharp, metallic, with an underlying sweetness that suggested organic solvents. Madison's voice came through the communication system with obvious concern. Tyler, my chemical detection equipment is showing readings I've never seen before. Multiple volatile compounds, some at concentrations that should be immediately lethal. Agent Taylor confirmed her readings. The contamination has definitely become more concentrated over time. Whatever natural processes were supposed to break down these chemicals, they're not working. We approached the main chemical processing building where we'd observed the electrical activity. Up close, it was clear that someone had done extensive work to make the facility operational again. New electrical cables, portable generators, ventilation equipment, and what appeared to be laboratory setups inside the building. "Agent Taylor," I reported, "someone has invested significant time and resources into restoring operations at this facility." Taylor was documenting everything with specialized cameras designed to function in contaminated environments. "Sergeant Camden, what we're seeing suggests long-term planning and substantial financial backing. This isn't casual trespassing." We entered the main building through a door that had been fitted with new locks and sealing equipment. Inside, the scene was more complex than anything I'd encountered in 15 years of police work. The building contained what appeared to be a sophisticated laboratory operation. Chemical processing equipment, computers, storage containers, and work areas that suggested multiple people had been conducting organized scientific activities inside the contaminated facility. Madison was examining one of the workstations. "Tyler, this equipment is designed for chemical analysis. Someone was studying the contamination, not just accessing it." Agent Taylor approached a bank of computer equipment that was still powered and operational. "Deputies, we need to document this carefully. What we're looking at appears to be a scientific research operation that's been ongoing inside this contaminated zone. Agent Taylor, who would conduct research inside a zone that's too dangerous for EPA personnel to enter without full protection. That's what we need to find out." As our team worked to document the laboratory equipment, I noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. Posted on the walls throughout the facility were detailed maps showing the contamination patterns throughout the exclusion zone, the locations of the most dangerous chemical concentrations, and what appeared to be extraction points for soil and groundwater samples. Agent Taylor, whoever was working in here, had detailed knowledge of the contamination distribution. Maps, sample locations, chemical analysis data. Taylor examined the wall-mounted materials. "Sergeant Camden, this level of detail would require access to classified EPA contamination surveys, information that's not available to the general public. Access to classified information, professional laboratory equipment, long-term operations inside a lethally contaminated zone." We weren't dealing with random trespassers or environmental activists, Madison called out from another section of the building. "Tyler, Agent Taylor, you need to see this." We joined her at what appeared to be a storage area filled with sealed containers labeled with chemical symbols and identification numbers. Dozens of containers, carefully organized and cataloged. "Madison, what are we looking at?" Concentrated samples of the industrial contamination. Someone was systematically extracting and refining the most dangerous chemicals in the zone. Agent Taylor was running chemical analysis on the containers with his portable detection equipment. These aren't just samples, deputies. These are refined, concentrated chemical weapons. Chemical weapons. Someone had been using the Meridian Contamination Zone as a source of raw materials for manufacturing chemical weapons. "Agent Taylor, how much concentrated material are we looking at?" "Based on the container sizes and estimated concentrations, enough refined chemical agents to contaminate several square miles if properly dispersed." I was immediately on the radio to dispatch. "Unit 15 to headquarters, requesting immediate contact with FBI and Homeland Security. we have discovered evidence of chemical weapons manufacturing at the Meridian site. But as I made that radio call, Madison discovered something that made the situation even more critical. Tyler, there are shipping records here. Dates, quantities, destination addresses. This wasn't just manufacturing. Someone was distributing these chemical weapons. The shipping records showed regular deliveries over a 6-month period to addresses in multiple states. Industrial chemicals concentrated from the Meridian contamination had been packaged and shipped to locations throughout the Midwest. Agent Taylor was coordinating with federal agencies while Madison and I continued documenting evidence. But as we worked, we began to understand that the laboratory operation was more sophisticated than initially apparent. The facility contained equipment for not just extracting and concentrating chemicals, but for modifying them. Chemical engineering equipment that could alter the properties of industrial contaminants to make them more suitable for weapons applications. Agent Taylor, I reported, we're looking at a chemical weapons development program, not just extraction and concentration. Understood, Sergeant. Federal authorities are classifying this as a potential domestic terrorism incident involving weapons of mass destruction. At 6:45 a.m., after nearly 3 hours inside the contaminated zone, our team completed the preliminary investigation and began extraction procedures. The decontamination process required 45 minutes of chemical washing and equipment inspection before we could safely leave our protective suits. Agent Taylor debriefed us as federal response teams prepared to secure the site. Deputies, what we found inside the Meridian Zone represents one of the most sophisticated domestic chemical weapons operations ever discovered. Professional laboratory equipment, classified information access, and distribution networks spanning multiple states. Madison asked, Agent Taylor, do we have any intelligence on who was responsible for this operation? That's under federal investigation, but based on the sophistication and resources required, we're looking at organized groups with significant technical expertise and financial backing. I was reviewing the evidence we documented. Agent Taylor, the 3 people we found collapsed at the fence. Were they part of this operation? They're being treated at a specialized facility for chemical exposure, but their condition is critical. The neurological damage from the contamination may be permanent. Permanent neurological damage. The people running the chemical weapons operation had been willing to accept brain damage and possible death to continue their work inside the contaminated zone. At 8:30 a.m., FBI Special Agent Ryan Torres arrived to coordinate the federal response. The Meridian site was reclassified from an EPA contamination zone to an active crime scene involving weapons of mass destruction. Sergeant Camden, Agent Torres briefed us. The chemical weapons operation you discovered has been under federal investigation for 8 months. We've been tracking the distribution network, but we couldn't identify the source of the weapons until now. Agent Torres, you knew about the chemical weapons distribution? We knew someone was manufacturing and distributing industrial chemical weapons, but the materials didn't match any known source. The chemical signatures were unique, consistent with industrial contamination rather than traditional weapons manufacturing. Madison spoke up. Agent Torres, how long had this operation been active? Based on the distribution records you found, approximately 18 months. Long enough to distribute chemical weapons to domestic terrorism groups in at least 12 states. 12 states. The Meridian contamination zone had been used as a source for chemical weapons that were now in the hands of terrorist groups throughout the country. Agent Torres, what's the threat assessment for these distributed weapons? Torres was quiet for a moment. Sergeant, the chemicals extracted from Meridian are some of the most dangerous industrial contaminants ever produced. If deployed against civilian populations, Even small quantities could cause mass casualties and long-term environmental damage. As federal agencies established security around the Meridian site and began tracking the distributed chemical weapons, Madison and I were debriefed on our role in the ongoing investigation. Deputies, Agent Torres explained, this case is now classified as domestic terrorism with national security implications. Your observation and initial response prevented the continuation of chemical weapons manufacturing, but the materials that were already distributed remain a significant threat. Agent Torres, what happens to the contamination zone now? The EPA will conduct enhanced containment of the chemical contamination, but the site will remain sealed indefinitely. The combination of original industrial contamination and the byproducts of weapons manufacturing makes it too dangerous for any future use. Too dangerous for any future use. The Meridian site would remain a contaminated wasteland permanently, a monument to industrial negligence and domestic terrorism. But as Madison and I returned to routine patrol duties, we realized that the chemical weapons manufacturing operation raised questions that went beyond the immediate security concerns. Tyler, Madison said as we completed our incident reports, whoever ran that operation had to know that working inside the contamination zone would cause permanent health damage. Why would they accept that risk? It was a good question. The people running the chemical weapons program had been willing to accept brain damage, respiratory failure, and possible death to continue their operations. That level of commitment suggested motivations that went beyond simple criminal profit. Madison, what if the contamination wasn't just a convenient source of chemical weapons? What if it was the point? What do you mean? What if someone wanted to demonstrate that abandoned industrial sites could be weaponized? That contamination zones like Meridian could be converted into chemical weapons manufacturing facilities? Madison considered the possibility. You're talking about using industrial negligence as a foundation for domestic terrorism. That's exactly what I was talking about. The United States has hundreds of abandoned industrial sites with various types of contamination. Most are sealed and monitored by EPA, but with limited security and infrequent inspections. If the Meridian operation was successful, it could serve as a model for similar operations at contaminated sites throughout the country. 2 weeks later, FBI raids in 12 states resulted in the seizure of chemical weapons derived from Meridian contamination and the arrest of 37 individuals connected to domestic terrorism organizations. But Agent Torres informed us that an estimated 40% of the manufactured chemical weapons had not been recovered. Madison took a transfer to another county after the medical evaluation revealed early signs of chemical exposure effects from our time inside the contamination zone. The doctors couldn't be sure whether the exposure would cause long-term health problems, but she decided not to risk continued work around industrial hazards. I remained on patrol in Millbrook County, but I requested reassignment to a sector that didn't include the Meridian site. The facility remains under federal security control, with enhanced monitoring and sealed access points. But sometimes I drive past the perimeter fencing and think about the laboratory we found inside that contaminated building. Professional equipment, detailed contamination maps, sophisticated chemical processing capabilities. And I wonder how many other abandoned industrial sites are being used the same way. The official investigation concluded that the Meridian chemical weapons operation was an isolated incident conducted by a domestic terrorism network with unusual technical capabilities. But I suspect it was something else. I suspect it was a proof of concept. 3 months after the federal raids, I thought the Meridian case was closed. 37 arrests, multiple chemical weapons seizures, enhanced security at contaminated industrial sites throughout the region. Agent Torres had assured us that the domestic terrorism network responsible for the operation had been dismantled. But on a Thursday night in June, I learned that our discovery at Meridian had been just the beginning. The call came in at 10:47 p.m. Dispatch sounded tense, the way she gets when federal agencies start coordinating with the local law enforcement. Unit 15, respond to the old Hartwell Metal Processing Plant, County Road 23 and Industrial Drive. Possible hazmat incident, EPA and FBI en route. The Hartwell plant had been abandoned since 2003 after groundwater contamination forced its closure. Like Meridian, it was supposedly sealed and monitored by EPA. Unlike Meridian, it had never been declared a formal exclusion zone because the contamination was considered less dangerous. I arrived to find Agent Torres already coordinating with EPA personnel. His presence at what should have been a routine hazmat call immediately told me we were dealing with something connected to the chemical weapons investigation. Sergeant Camden, Torres approached my patrol unit as I parked outside the plant perimeter. We've got a situation that's directly related to your Meridian discovery. Someone has been replicating that operation at multiple sites throughout the region. Multiple sites. The chemical weapons manufacturing wasn't limited to Meridian. It was part of a coordinated network using abandoned industrial facilities. Agent Torres, how many sites are we talking about? Based on intelligence developed from the federal raids, at least 6 facilities in 3 states. All abandoned industrial plants with existing chemical contamination. All accessed by the same network that was operating at Meridian. Torres briefed me as EPA technicians prepared to enter the Hartwell facility. The pattern was identical to what we'd found at Meridian. Cut fence lines, restored electrical systems, laboratory equipment for processing chemical weapons from industrial contamination. Agent Torres, if this network was operating at 6 different sites, how much chemical weapon material are we talking about? Sergeant, our analysis suggests they produced enough concentrated chemical agents to contaminate major portions of several cities. The operation was much larger than we initially realized. EPA agent Morgan Taylor arrived with the same hazmat team that had processed the Meridian site. He was clearly frustrated with the scope of what they were discovering. Sergeant Camden, Taylor approached as his team suited up. This is the 4th contaminated facility we've found evidence of weapons manufacturing in the past month. The pattern is consistent. Someone with detailed knowledge of EPA contamination records has been systematically targeting every major industrial site in the region. Agent Taylor, who would have access to that kind of information? That's what's troubling us. The contamination data these people were using is classified. Detailed soil surveys, chemical distribution maps, concentration gradients, information that's only available to EPA personnel and authorized contractors. Inside access, again. Just like at the Pemberton ammunition plant, someone with federal security clearance was providing information to domestic terrorists. At 11:30 p.m., the EPA team entered the Hartwell facility and confirmed what we suspected. Extensive laboratory operations, chemical processing equipment, and evidence of systematic extraction and concentration of industrial contaminants. But they found something else that elevated the threat level even further. "Command, this is Hazmat Team Leader," came the radio transmission from inside the facility. "We've got evidence that the Hartwell operation was more advanced than Meridian. They weren't just concentrating existing contaminants. They were synthesizing new chemical compounds." Agent Torres responded immediately. "Hazmat team, confirm your report. Synthesis of new compounds? Confirmed, Command. Laboratory equipment for organic chemistry, stocks of precursor chemicals, and synthesis protocols documented in multiple languages." This wasn't just weapons manufacturing. It was weapons development. Weapons development. Someone had been using abandoned industrial sites not just to extract chemical weapons from existing contamination, but to develop entirely new types of chemical weapons. Torres was coordinating with federal chemical weapons experts while I maintained perimeter security. But as the EPA team continued their assessment, they made discoveries that transformed our understanding of the entire operation. Command, Hazmat Team. We've found shipping records indicating that synthesized materials were being distributed to the same network addresses identified in the Meridian investigation. But there's more. Production schedules showing coordination between multiple facilities, as if the entire network was operating on a coordinated timeline. This wasn't just multiple terrorist cells operating independently. It was a single organization using multiple facilities to conduct large-scale chemical weapons production. At 1:15 a.m., Agent Torres received intelligence that changed the scope of the investigation from regional to national. Sergeant Camden, he briefed me. NSA intercepts indicate that the chemical weapons network extended beyond the facilities we've identified. Communication intercepts suggest operations at contaminated industrial sites in at least 8 states. Agent Torres, what's the operational objective of a network that large? Torres was quiet for a moment. Based on the production capacity we've documented and the distribution patterns we've tracked, this network was preparing for coordinated chemical weapons attacks on multiple cities simultaneously. Multiple cities. Simultaneous attacks. This wasn't domestic terrorism. This was chemical warfare against the American civilian population. Agent Torres, do we have intelligence on the timing of these coordinated attacks? That's what we're trying to determine. But based on production schedules and distribution records, the network appears to have been preparing for a major operation that was supposed to occur within the next several months. The EPA team completed their assessment of the Hartwell facility at 3:45 a.m. Agent Taylor's debrief confirmed the scope of what we were dealing with. Sergeant Camden, the chemical weapons development at Hartwell was more sophisticated than anything we found at Meridian. Professional laboratory equipment, advanced synthesis capabilities, and production volumes that suggest industrial-scale manufacturing. Agent Taylor, what kind of chemical weapons were they developing? Based on the equipment and documented protocols, they were developing binary chemical agents, compounds that are harmless separately but become lethal when mixed. This would allow them to transport weapons components without triggering detection systems. Binary weapons. Chemical agents designed to avoid detection during transportation, then combined at the target location to create lethal compounds. But as we documented the Hartwell facility, I noticed something that bothered me about the entire operation. The laboratory setups, the distribution records, the coordination between facilities, it all looked too professional, too well organized for a typical domestic terrorism cell. Agent Torres, I said during a brief break in the documentation, the sophistication of this network, the access to classified information, the coordination between multiple states, doesn't this seem beyond the capabilities of typical domestic terrorists? Torres was quiet for a long moment. Sergeant Camden, that's exactly what's been troubling federal investigators. The technical expertise, the financial resources, the operational coordination. It suggests support from sources with capabilities that exceed typical domestic organizations. Support from sources with advanced capabilities. Foreign involvement in domestic chemical weapons operations. At 5:30 a.m., as federal agencies established security around the Hartwell site, Agent Torres briefed me on the broader investigation. Sergeant, your discovery at Meridian led us to uncover one of the most sophisticated domestic chemical weapons networks ever documented. Operations at multiple facilities, advanced development capabilities, and distribution systems designed to support coordinated attacks on American cities. Agent Torres, how close were they to executing these attacks? Based on production schedules and intelligence intercepts, we believe we interdicted the network approximately 2 months before they planned to begin deployment. 2 months. If our routine patrol hadn't spotted lights inside the Meridian exclusion zone, chemical weapons attacks on multiple American cities might have been executed within weeks. But there was something else about the timing that concerned me. Agent Torres, if this network was so close to executing major attacks, why were they still conducting development work at Hartwell? Why not focus all resources on deployment? Torres considered my question. That's been puzzling investigators as well. The continued development work suggests either that their attack timeline was more flexible than intelligence indicated, or that they were preparing for multiple phases of operations. Multiple phases. The chemical weapons network might have been planning not just initial attacks, but sustained campaigns using increasingly sophisticated weapons. Over the following days, federal agencies conducted security assessments at contaminated industrial sites throughout the region. Enhanced perimeter security, increased monitoring, and coordination with local law enforcement for regular patrol activities. But the investigation also revealed disturbing patterns that suggested the network's operations had been even more extensive than initially suspected. Agent Taylor called me 3 days after the Hartwell discovery, with information that expanded our understanding of the threat. Sergeant Camden, our analysis of the chemical compounds found at Hartwell indicates that some of the weapons development was focused on creating agents specifically designed to defeat standard hazmat protection. Agent Taylor, what do you mean? Chemical agents that could penetrate standard protective equipment worn by emergency responders. If deployed against first responders during an attack, these compounds could incapacitate the personnel trying to provide emergency medical treatment and decontamination. Weapons designed to target emergency responders. The network hadn't just been preparing to attack civilians. They'd been preparing to systematically disable the emergency response infrastructure that would try to help attack victims. Agent Taylor, how advanced was this anti-protection weapon development? Advanced enough that we're recommending upgraded protective equipment for all hazmat teams nationwide. The compounds they developed could potentially defeat protection systems that have been standard for decades. A week later, Agent Torres provided a final briefing on what had been discovered during the expanded investigation. Sergeant Camden, the chemical weapons network you helped uncover, was preparing for what intelligence analysis indicates was the largest coordinated domestic attack in American history. Simultaneous chemical weapons deployment in at least 12 major cities, using agents specifically designed to maximize casualties and defeat emergency response. 12 major cities. Millions of potential casualties. Agent Torres, do we have any intelligence on the ultimate motivation for an attack of that scope? Based on communications intercepts and documents recovered from network facilities, the objective appears to have been systematic disruption of American economic and governmental capabilities. Not just terrorism, but an attempt to fundamentally disable American society. Systematic disruption of American society. The chemical weapons network had been preparing for something approaching chemical warfare against the entire civilian population. Agent Torres, have all the network members been apprehended? Torres was quiet for a moment. We've arrested 127 individuals in 15 states, and we've secured the major production facilities. But communication intercepts suggest there may be additional cells or affiliated organizations that we haven't identified. Additional cells. The possibility that other groups with similar capabilities might still be operating at contaminated industrial sites throughout the country. 3 months after the Hartwell discovery, Madison called me from her new assignment in another state. Her medical condition had stabilized, but she was still dealing with ongoing effects from chemical exposure. "Tyler," she said during our conversation, I've been following the federal investigation reports. 127 arrests, multiple facilities, weapons designed to defeat protection equipment. Do you really think we stopped all of them? It was a question I'd been avoiding. Madison, what do you mean? I mean that an operation that's sophisticated, that well-funded, that broadly distributed across multiple states, it seems too big to be completely eliminated by even extensive federal raids. She was expressing the same concern that had been troubling me. The chemical weapons network had demonstrated capabilities that suggested resources and planning beyond typical domestic terrorism organizations. Madison, you think there are other networks? I think what we found was the operational component of something larger. The people who provided the funding, the classified information, the technical expertise, those people probably weren't arrested because they weren't directly involved in the production facilities. The people behind the network, the sources of funding and information who had enabled 127 Americans to establish chemical weapons manufacturing operations at contaminated industrial sites throughout the country. Over the following months, I continued routine patrols that included monitoring of secured contaminated sites in my sector. But I also began paying closer attention to abandoned industrial facilities that hadn't been involved in the original investigation. And what I observed was troubling. Fresh tire tracks at supposedly abandoned facilities. New security equipment at sites that had been empty for years. Signs of recent electrical work at plants that had been without power since closure. Activity that suggested someone was still interested in the potential of abandoned industrial contamination for weapons development. I reported my observations through federal channels, but the responses were increasingly bureaucratic. Budget constraints limited follow-up investigations. Personnel shortages reduced monitoring capabilities. Political priorities shifted focus to other security concerns. The enhanced security that had been implemented after the Meridian discovery was gradually scaled back as other threats demanded attention and resources. But the contaminated industrial sites remained. Thousands of facilities throughout the country with various types of dangerous contamination, limited security, and proven potential for weapons applications. The official investigation concluded that the chemical weapons network had been successfully dismantled with comprehensive apprehension of operational personnel. But I suspected that the operational personnel were just the most visible component of something much larger. Something that had demonstrated American vulnerabilities on a scale that foreign intelligence services and hostile organizations would find very interesting to study and potentially replicate. The Meridian exclusion zone remains under federal security control, but with reduced monitoring staff and scaled-back perimeter patrols. The Hartwell facility has been reclassified as a low-priority site with annual inspection schedules instead of the continuous monitoring that was initially implemented. Both sites continue to show elevated chemical readings that suggest ongoing contamination processes that may be creating new opportunities for weapons development. And both sites remain attractive targets for anyone who learned from the network we thought we had completely eliminated. Sometimes, driving past the federal barriers around these contaminated sites, I think about the laboratory equipment we found inside those buildings. Professional chemical development capabilities, advanced synthesis protocols, coordination systems for multi-state operations, and I wonder who else might have been taking notes. 8 months after the network raids, I thought I understood the scope of what we had uncovered. 127 arrests across 15 states, enhanced security at contaminated sites nationwide, congressional hearings on industrial security oversight. The chemical weapons network appeared to have been completely dismantled. But on a Friday morning in February 2021, Agent Torres called me with information that changed everything I thought I knew about the Meridian investigation. Sergeant Camden, I need to meet with you regarding new developments in the chemical weapons case. Can you meet me at the Federal Building this afternoon?" There was something in Torres's voice that suggested this wasn't a routine follow-up interview. I arrived at the Federal Building at 2 p.m. to find Torres waiting with FBI Assistant Director Sarah Mitchell and EPA Regional Administrator David Chen. The presence of senior federal officials told me immediately that whatever they were about to discuss was far more significant than a local law enforcement briefing. "Sergeant Camden," Assistant Director Mitchell began, "what I'm about to share with you is classified, but your role in the original investigation gives you a need to know. The chemical weapons network you discovered was not a domestic terrorism operation. Not domestic terrorism. I had spent 8 months believing that we'd interdicted a sophisticated terrorist organization planning chemical attacks on American cities." "Director Mitchell, what do you mean it wasn't domestic terrorism?" Mitchell consulted a classified briefing document. "The network was a foreign intelligence operation designed to assess American vulnerability to chemical weapons attacks using abandoned industrial infrastructure." Foreign intelligence. The chemical weapons manufacturing, the coordinated operations across multiple states, the systematic targeting of contaminated industrial sites, all of it had been sponsored by a foreign government. "Director Mitchell, which foreign government?" "That remains classified, Sergeant. But what's important for you to understand is that the 127 individuals we arrested were predominantly American citizens who believed they were participating in domestic resistance activities. Most were unaware they were working for foreign intelligence services." Agent Torres spoke up. "Sergeant, the technical expertise, the financial backing, the access to classified EPA contamination data, all of it came from foreign intelligence operatives who had been recruiting American assets for nearly 3 years. American assets, citizens who had been manipulated into conducting chemical weapons operations on behalf of foreign intelligence services, believing they were participating in domestic political resistance." EPA Administrator Chen provided additional context. "Sergeant Camden, the contamination data that enabled the network to target specific industrial sites was obtained through cyber intrusions into EPA databases. Foreign intelligence services had been systematically gathering information about American industrial contamination sites for at least 5 years. 5 years of preparation. Foreign intelligence services had been planning to weaponize American industrial contamination since approximately 2015. "Director Mitchell, what was the ultimate objective of this foreign operation?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment before responding. "Based on intelligence analysis, the objective was twofold. First, to demonstrate that American industrial infrastructure could be weaponized by hostile actors. Second, to gather intelligence on American emergency response capabilities and vulnerabilities." Demonstration and intelligence gathering. The chemical weapons network hadn't been planning to actually conduct attacks on American cities. They'd been conducting a large-scale assessment of American vulnerabilities while simultaneously proving that such attacks were possible. Torres continued the briefing. "Sergeant, the foreign operatives allowed us to discover and intercept their network because the intelligence value came from observing our response. They learned about federal coordination protocols, local law enforcement capabilities, hazmat response procedures, and medical treatment capacity for chemical weapons casualties." "Agent Torres, you're saying they wanted us to find them?" "We believe the Meridian discovery was orchestrated. The lights you observed, the obvious evidence of activity, it was designed to trigger law enforcement response so the foreign intelligence services could assess our reaction." I sat back in my chair, processing the implications. Our entire investigation, the federal raids, the congressional hearings, All of it had been manipulated by foreign intelligence operatives who wanted to study American response to chemical weapons threats. Director Mitchell, if they wanted us to discover their network, what happened to the 40% of chemical weapons that were never recovered? Mitchell exchanged looks with Torres and Chen before responding. Those weapons were never intended for deployment against American targets. They were transported out of the country for analysis by foreign technical intelligence services. Foreign analysis of chemical weapons derived from American industrial contamination. They hadn't just been assessing our vulnerabilities. They'd been reverse engineering American industrial chemicals to understand their potential for weapons applications. EPA Administrator Chen provided the final piece of the puzzle. Sergeant Camden, our post-incident analysis revealed that the foreign operatives had tested chemical weapons extraction techniques at over 200 contaminated industrial sites nationwide. The 6 sites where we found active operations were just the locations they allowed us to discover. 200 sites. Foreign intelligence operatives had been systematically testing chemical weapons extraction at contaminated industrial facilities throughout the United States for years, and we had only detected their activities at 6 locations. Administrator Chen, are those other 194 sites still being monitored? Enhanced monitoring has been implemented at high-priority contaminated sites, but comprehensive security for all potentially vulnerable locations would require resources that exceed current federal capacity. Resources that exceed current capacity. The foreign intelligence operation had revealed that the United States had thousands of contaminated industrial sites that could be weaponized, but lacked the resources to secure them all. Assistant Director Mitchell provided the classified summary that had prompted my briefing. Sergeant Camden, foreign intelligence analysis of American industrial contamination has been shared with hostile nations and non-state actors worldwide. The techniques developed during this operation are now available to any group with the motivation and resources to exploit American industrial vulnerabilities. The techniques were now available worldwide. What had started as a foreign intelligence assessment had become a blueprintable methodology for converting American industrial negligence into chemical weapons. Director Mitchell, what's the current threat assessment? Mitchell consulted her classified materials. Intelligence indicates that at least 3 other foreign intelligence services and multiple non-state actors have initiated programs based on the techniques developed during the Meridian operation. We're tracking potential chemical weapons operations at contaminated industrial sites in 17 states. 17 states. The foreign intelligence operation hadn't just revealed American vulnerabilities, it had inspired copycat operations by other hostile actors. As the briefing concluded, I realized that our discovery at Meridian had been simultaneously more important and less successful than I had understood. We had interdicted a foreign intelligence operation, but in doing so we had confirmed that American industrial contamination could be systematically weaponized. Director Mitchell, what's my role in ongoing operations? Local law enforcement remains critical for early detection of unauthorized activity at contaminated sites. Your observation of lights inside the Meridian exclusion zone was the first indication that industrial contamination was being weaponized. Similar observations by patrol officers nationwide are essential for identifying future operations. Torres walked me to my vehicle after the briefing. Tyler, there's something else you should know. Madison's chemical exposure symptoms. They weren't caused by the Meridian contamination. What do you mean? Medical analysis revealed that her symptoms were caused by exposure to synthetic chemical agents that don't match the original industrial contamination. The foreign operatives had been testing enhanced chemical weapons inside the exclusion zone, using concentrations that were significantly more dangerous than the original contamination. Madison had been exposed to experimental chemical weapons during our investigation, not just industrial contamination. The foreign intelligence operatives had been using the Meridian site to test weapons designed specifically to harm law enforcement personnel responding to contaminated sites. Torres, how is Madison's health? She's receiving specialized treatment, but the long-term prognosis is uncertain. The synthetic agents she was exposed to were designed to cause progressive neurological damage. Progressive neurological damage. Madison's career-ending medical condition was the result of foreign intelligence operatives testing chemical weapons designed to incapacitate American law enforcement. 6 months later, congressional appropriations provided funding for enhanced security at approximately 400 high-priority contaminated industrial sites nationwide. The remaining sites continue to receive limited monitoring due to budget constraints. Madison's medical condition required early retirement and ongoing specialized treatment. The medical experts cannot determine whether her symptoms will stabilize or continue progressing. I remained on patrol duties in Millbrook County, but my sector was reassigned to exclude the Meridian and Hartwell sites, which remain under permanent federal security control. But the psychological impact of learning that our entire investigation had been manipulated by foreign intelligence services was more difficult to process than the original chemical weapons discovery. Every abandoned industrial site, every contaminated facility, every federal security barrier became a reminder that American industrial negligence had been systematically weaponized by foreign actors who understood our vulnerabilities better than we understood them ourselves. The official classification of the Meridian operation remains Foreign Intelligence Collection Successfully Interdicted with Limited Operational Impact. But for those of us who lived through it, who discovered that we had been unwitting participants in a foreign assessment of American vulnerabilities, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like we had lost something we hadn't known we were supposed to protect. The Meridian exclusion zone remains under federal security control, with enhanced monitoring systems and specialized response protocols. But the contamination continues to migrate beyond the original perimeter, requiring expansion of the restricted area. The Hartwell facility has been reclassified as a national security site, with permanent federal oversight and restricted access protocols that exceed those used for military installations. Both sites continue to generate elevated chemical readings that suggest ongoing contamination processes that are not well understood, and both sites remain under surveillance for activities that may indicate renewed foreign intelligence interest in American industrial vulnerabilities. Sometimes I drive past the federal barriers around Meridian and Hartwell and think about the laboratory equipment we found inside those contaminated buildings. Professional chemical processing capabilities, detailed contamination maps, synthesis protocols documented in multiple languages. And I wonder how many foreign intelligence operatives learned from the operation we thought we had disrupted. The Congressional Report on Industrial Contamination Security concluded that enhanced monitoring and security measures have significantly reduced vulnerabilities at high-priority sites. But thousands of contaminated industrial facilities throughout the United States remain lightly secured and infrequently inspected. And foreign intelligence services now possess detailed knowledge of how to systematically identify and exploit those sites for chemical weapons development. Madison calls me occasionally to discuss her medical treatment and ongoing symptoms. The progressive neurological damage has affected her memory and coordination, but her understanding of what we discovered at Meridian remains clear. Tyler, she told me during our last conversation, the worst part isn't the medical condition. The worst part is knowing that we helped them perfect their techniques. She's right. Our investigation, our response, our federal coordination, All of it provided foreign intelligence services with detailed information about American capabilities and limitations for responding to chemical weapons threats. We thought we were preventing attacks on American cities. Instead, we were providing foreign intelligence services with a comprehensive assessment of American vulnerabilities to chemical weapons attacks. The Meridian contamination zone will remain sealed and monitored for the next 50 to 75 years. But the intelligence gathered during the foreign operation will remain valuable to hostile actors for much longer than that. And the techniques developed for weaponizing American industrial contamination are now available to anyone with the motivation and resources to study the comprehensive documentation we unwittingly helped to create. Sometimes, I think the most dangerous thing we discovered at Meridian wasn't the chemical weapons laboratory. It was the knowledge that we had already lost a war we didn't know we were fighting,